Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when America had a colossal, nation-splitting, 4-year-long screaming match with itself that resulted in over 600,000 people dying. Think of it as the world's worst group project, where the two main partners who already hated each other decided the only way to resolve their creative differences was with cannons. We're talking, of course, about the American Civil War. Now, are we about to boil down decades of complex socioeconomic tension into a narrative about two angry roommates? Absolutely. Is it historically irresponsible? Probably. But is it more entertaining? You bet your sweet tea it is. Before the inevitable betrayal starts, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated, so let's set the scene. It's the mid-19th century, and the United States of America is like a teenager who's just hit a massive growth spurt. It's awkward, gangly, and bursting with a completely unearned sense of confidence. It's got pimples, its voice is cracking, but it struts around like it owns the place because, well, it kinda thinks it does. This adolescent nation is basically one big sprawling house shared by two siblings who could not be more different if one was a spreadsheet and the other was a mint julep that had somehow gained sentience and a deep-seated sense of grievance. In one part of the house, you have the North. Let's call him Indy, for industrial. Indy is a go-getter. He's all about progress, factories, railroads, and the glorious clang of metal on metal. He gets up early, puts on his sensible work boots, and spends all day inventing new ways to make money and build things. He's got cities teeming with loud, bustling immigrants, and he firmly believes that the future is paved with steel and powered by steam. Indy is ambitious, a little bit arrogant, and increasingly self-righteous. He looks at the other side of the house and just sees inefficiency, laziness, a total waste of potential. And there's this one big, glaring moral stain that's really starting to chap his hide. The whole slavery thing. Not because he's necessarily a saint. Let's be clear. Racism was an all-American pastime enjoyed coast to coast, but because owning people just felt archaic. It was bad for business, it was messy, and it was making the whole American land of the free brand look super hypocritical to the fancy European countries he was trying to impress. And then, in the other, much more ornate and veranda-equipped part of the house, you have the South. Let's call him Cotton. Cotton is different. He's all about tradition, honor, and a romanticized vision of the past that probably never existed. His entire life revolves around a single massive enterprise, agriculture. Specifically, growing mountains of cotton to fuel Indy's textile mills up north and Britain's factories across the ocean. Cotton sees himself as a refined, honorable gentleman, a cavalier straight out of a Walter Scott novel. He values chivalry, family, and a rigid social hierarchy where everyone knows their place. The problem? This entire grand column-adorned lifestyle is built on a foundation of human bondage. Chattel slavery isn't just part of his economy. It is his economy. It's his social structure, his political power, his entire identity wrapped up in one peculiar institution. For decades, these two have been living in a state of simmering, passive-aggressive tension. They'd argue about taxes, tariffs, about how much power the central dad government should have, and about whose turn it was to take out the national trash. But underneath every single squabble, every debate, every eye roll across the congressional dinner table was the one issue they couldn't compromise on: slavery. Indy saw it as a moral cancer and an economic dead end holding the country back. Cotton saw it as a God-given right, an absolute necessity, and the very bedrock of his civilization. This brings us to the core of the drama, the central argument that would eventually tear the house apart. What to do with the new rooms? America kept expanding, you see, kept adding new wings to the house, new territories out west. And every single time a new room was built, Indy and Cotton would have the exact same explosive fight. Will this be a free room or a slave room? For the South, every new free state was another nail in its political coffin, a shift in the balance of power that threatened its existence. For the North, every new slave state was the horrifying spread of a disease it was desperately trying to contain. The dialogue between them had become fundamentally broken. It was less of a conversation and more of a shouting match between two people who were no longer speaking the same language. Personified dialogue. North. Barging into the parlor, holding a blueprint. Okay, look, we just got this massive new plot of land out west. Fantastic potential. I'm thinking factories, railroads, maybe a few schools. South. Slowly lowering his newspaper, peering over his spectacles. Son, you will do no such thing. That land is perfect for cultivation. We'll extend the plantation system. It's our right. Our property follows us wherever we go. North, you can't be serious. We can't keep letting this thing spread. It's 1850. It's barbaric, and it's dragging the family name through the mud. South. Barbaric. It is our heritage. It is the divinely ordained order of things. You talk of progress, but you want to destroy the very economic engine that fills your own pockets. Who do you think picks the cotton for your precious little factories? North. That's not the point. The point is you can't just label people as property and drag them into new territories. South. Watch me. This conversation is over. You are attacking my honor and my way of life, and I will not stand for it. And that's the real insanity of the situation. This wasn't a simple political disagreement anymore. It was a complete and total divergence of reality. The two sides were living in different moral universes. The South had convinced itself that owning another human being was not only acceptable, but was a positive good, a civilizing force. The North, while far from perfect, was increasingly coming to the conclusion that this was a national sin that could not be allowed to expand. They had reached a point where compromise was impossible because their fundamental definitions of words like liberty, property, and human were diametrically opposed. The foundation of the American house wasn't just cracked. It was built over a sinkhole, and the floorboards were starting to groan. The breakup was coming. It was just a matter of who was going to throw the first punch. So the American house is basically a silent war zone, with North and South glaring at each other over the breakfast table, arguing about the thermostat, and generally making life miserable. But what really kicks this Cold War into a higher gear is America's addiction to expansion. This wasn't just a casual hobby. It was a full-blown national ideology with a fancy, semi-religious name, Manifest Destiny. This was the widespread belief that God, the universe, or some other cosmic real estate agent had personally handed the United States the deed to the entire North American continent, and it was their sacred duty to go claim it. It was a heady cocktail of national pride, Protestant zeal, and good old-fashioned greed, and America was chugging it like it was going out of style. Think of the United States at this point as a young man who is convinced he is the main character of reality. He's running west, arms outstretched, shouting, "It's my destiny," while tripping over mountain ranges and planting flags on anything that doesn't run away fast enough. He'd already made the deal of the century with the Louisiana Purchase, basically buying a geographic superpower for pennies on the dollar from a distracted Napoleon. He'd persuaded Spain to give him Florida. He'd annexed Texas. This kid had a land addiction, and his eyes were now greedily fixed on the vast, sun-drenched territories owned by Mexico. Now, for a while, there was a flimsy, duct-taped solution to the how do we furnish the new rooms problem. It was called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was the original roommate agreement, drawn up when Missouri wanted to join the club as a slave state, which would have tipped the delicate balance of power in the Senate. The Senate, you see, was the one place where the North and South had equal footing. It was a political Jenga tower. For every free state, there was a slave state, keeping things perfectly, terrifyingly balanced. So, to keep the tower from crashing down, they came up with a deal. Missouri could come in as a slave state, but they'd carve out Maine from Massachusetts to come in as a free state, restoring balance. And most importantly, they drew a line across the country at the 3630 parallel. The rule was simple. Any new states created north of this line had to be free. Anything south of it could be slave. Everyone sort of squinted at it, agreed it was a terrible solution, and then promptly signed it because the alternative was a fistfight. For about 25 years, This imaginary line on a map held the country together with all the structural integrity of wet toilet paper. But then came the Mexican-American War. In a fit of pure, unadulterated manifest destiny, America picked a fight with Mexico, won decisively, and in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, relieved Mexico of about 55% of its territory. This was a land haul of epic proportions. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. America, the teenager, had just been handed the keys to a brand new mansion. The problem was, this mansion was built directly on top of the one issue that made him completely psychotic. The South looked at this new territory, saw that most of it was south of the Missouri Compromise line, and started salivating. They envisioned a vast, sprawling empire for slavery stretching all the way to the Pacific. New slave states, more political power, a future where cotton would be king forever. The North looked at the exact same map and had a panic attack. They saw a future where the country would be dominated by a powerful slavocracy, where the dream of free labor and small farms would be choked out by the plantation system. The Missouri Compromise line, the one thing keeping the peace, was now utterly useless because it didn't apply to this new land and nobody could agree on how it should. The Jenga tower was wobbling violently. The triumph of manifest destiny had become its greatest crisis. America had successfully conquered its neighbors, only to find that it had created the perfect conditions to conquer itself. Personified dialogue. Britain, sipping tea, observing America through a monocle. Jolly good show, old boy. You've certainly expanded. One must ask, do you have the foggiest notion of what you're going to do with all of that? America, wearing a coonskin cap and covered in dust, holding a giant map. Do with it? I'm going to do everything with it. I'm going to build railroads that punch through mountains. I'm going to find gold. I'm going to grow stuff. It's going to be amazing. The biggest, bestest, freedomist country ever. Britain, quite. But you and your southern half seem to have rather divergent opinions on the definition of freedom. Won't adding a landmass the size of Western Europe to the equation rather inflame the situation? America, inflame? No. It'll be great. We'll work it out. We always do. We'll just, draw a new line. Or maybe we'll let the new folks vote on it. Democracy, baby. It solves everything. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I saw a shiny bit of Oregon that needs liberating. Britain, muttering to himself as America sprints off. He's going to vote on it. Oh, this will be rich. The boy's a complete lunatic. And this is the beautiful, tragic absurdity of the whole affair. The very act of national consolidation was an act of national dissolution. America's quest for greatness, its divinely inspired sprint to the Pacific, was creating a political bomb that no one knew how to defuse. They had gobbled up more land than they could politically digest. Every square mile of new territory became another battleground in the escalating Cold War between North and South. The map was bigger, but the house was more divided than ever. They had built their dream home on a seismic fault, and the first tremors were already shaking the walls. Something had to give, and that something would be the pathetic, paper-thin compromise of 1850. The giant, shuddering tremor that finally cracks the plaster in the American house comes from the one place everyone was greedily dreaming about, California. Just as the politicians are getting ready to have a decade-long soul-crushing debate about what to do with the new Mexican Secession lands, some guy building a sawmill for John Sutter in 1848 sees something shiny in the water. It's gold. And with that one discovery, the entire timetable for national collapse gets thrown into a wood chipper. The news spreads like wildfire, and the gold rush is on. This isn't a slow, orderly migration. This is a human tsunami. Within a year, 100,000 people, dubbed the 49ers, descend on California, a chaotic horde of prospectors, merchants, gamblers, and scoundrels from every corner of the globe, all looking to get rich quick. The population explodes so fast that California completely skips the awkward teenage territory phase and shows up on Washington's doorstep in 1849, demanding to be let in as a full-fledged adult state. And here's the kicker, the line that sends a jolt of pure terror through the southern half of the country. California's proposed state constitution explicitly bans slavery. Why is this a crisis? Because of the Jenga tower. Remember the Senate? The sacred, perfectly balanced institution with 15 free states and 15 slave states? Admitting California as a free state would topple it. The count would be 16 to 15. The balance would be broken forever in favor of the North. For the South, this isn't just a political setback, it's an existential threat. This is the moment they've been dreading. This is the North gaining the power to eventually legislate their entire way of life out of existence. The response is immediate and furious. Southern leaders start openly talking about secession. Not as a vague threat anymore, but as a concrete action plan. The country is closer to splintering than it has ever been. Into this five-alarm fire walks the great triumvirate, the three aging titans of the Senate, for one last epic performance. You have Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser, the architect of the Missouri Compromise, now a frail old man trying to glue the nation back together with sheer willpower. You have Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, the thunderous orator of the North, who sees the abyss opening up and decides that saving the Union is more important than anything else. And then you have John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the intellectual godfather of Southern nationalism. He's literally dying of tuberculosis, a skeletal figure wrapped in flannels, too weak to deliver his own speech. He sits there, a grim specter with burning eyes, while another senator reads his final apocalyptic warning. Compromise is impossible, the South is being backed into a corner, and the only options left are submission or secession. Out of this crucible of desperation, Clay forges his last great masterpiece of political evasion, the Compromise of 1850. It is not one clean bill, it's a messy, five-part legislative Frankenstein, cobbled together and shoved through Congress by a younger Senator, Stephen Douglas, after Clay's initial omnibus bill failed. It is designed to give everyone just enough of what they want to stop them from burning the house down, while also forcing them to swallow something they find utterly revolting. Here's the deal they struck. First, for the North, California gets to come in as a free state. This is the big prize. The balance of power is broken. Score 1 for Indy. They also get a small, symbolic victory. The slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings, is outlawed in Washington, D.C. You can still own slaves in the nation's capital. You just can't have open-air slave markets anymore, which is a bit like saying you can have a meth lab in the lobby of the Hilton, but the guest rooms are fair game. For the South, the deal is more of a gamble. The new territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized under a shiny new principle called popular sovereignty. This means the white settlers in those territories would eventually get to vote on whether to allow slavery. The South hopes they'll vote yes, but it's a roll of the dice. But the real pound of flesh they extract from the North, the most toxic and consequential part of this entire bargain, is a new and brutally effective Fugitive Slave Act. Personified dialogue. North Gertie, pacing nervously. Look, the gold-crazed masses have spoken. California is a free state. We have the votes. It's happening. South, sitting calmly in a wingback chair, cleaning a dueling pistol. Is it now? If you think for 1 second that we will stand by and allow you to permanently seize control of the Senate and trample our rights, you are more foolish than you look. You want California? There will be concessions. North. Fine. We'll let the desert territories vote. It's a dumb idea that's going to lead to chaos, but fine. What else? South. Oh, something much more personal. Our property has a regrettable tendency to seek what it mistakenly calls freedom in your cities. This new law will deputize every single federal marshal, every judge, every citizen in your holier-than-thou states. When we come looking for our runaways, you will not just step aside. You will actively help us. You will form pauses. You will clap them in irons, and you will return them. No trials, no testimony from the accused, just our word against theirs, and our word is the only one that counts. North stares in horror. You want my people to become slave catchers? To hunt human beings in the streets of Concord and send them back to a life of bondage? That's monstrous. South. It's the law, or it will be. That, my friend, is the price of your precious union. Choke on it. And that is the poison pill at the heart of the Compromise of 1850. It wasn't a solution. It was a hostage negotiation where both sides left feeling violated. The North got California but had to stomach the Fugitive Slave Act, a law so abhorrent it turned thousands of previously indifferent Northerners into staunch abolitionists overnight. It brought the reality of slavery, the chains, the terror, the injustice, out of the distant South and dropped it right onto their main streets. The South, meanwhile, felt it had been blackmailed into accepting an unbalanced Senate in exchange for a law they knew the North would despise and resist. The compromise didn't heal the rift. It just papered over the chasm while pouring acid on the foundations. It bought the country a few years of tense, seething peace, but it made the eventual explosion all the more certain. The Compromise of 1850 may have put a legislative bandage on the country's gaping wound, but the Fugitive Slave Act was like rubbing salt, lemon juice, and ghost peppers directly into it. For many Northerners, the law was an outrage, a federal mandate forcing them to be complicit in a system they found increasingly disgusting. And right into this charged atmosphere of resentment and moral conflict, a book falls like a lightning strike. A book that would do more to galvanize Northern anti-slavery opinion than any speech, sermon, or political pamphlet ever could. It was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe was not a radical, bomb-throwing activist. She was a Connecticut-born author, teacher, mother of 6, and a member of one of the most famous religious families in America. Living in Cincinnati, Ohio, just across the river from the slave state of Kentucky, she had a front-row seat to the human cost of slavery. She sheltered runaway slaves in her home and heard their stories of brutalization and escape. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 lit a fire in her. As the story goes, she was sitting in church when she had a vision of a slave being flogged to death. She went home, overwhelmed, and declared, "I will write something. I will if I live." And boy, did she write something. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, was first published in 41 weekly installments in an abolitionist newspaper. When it was released as a book in 1852, it exploded. This wasn't just a bestseller, it was a cultural supernova. In its first year, it sold 300,000 copies in the United States alone. To put that in perspective, a book was considered a roaring success back then if it sold 5,000 copies. It went on to sell millions worldwide, becoming the second best-selling book of the entire 19th century, right behind some obscure title you may have heard of called the Bible. It was the 1850s equivalent of going viral. It was translated into over 30 languages. It spawned merchandise, stage plays, and songs. It was, in short, an absolute phenomenon. The book's power wasn't in its complex political arguments. Its power was that it took the abstract, distant issue of slavery and made it deeply, painfully personal. Stowe's genius was her ability to weaponize sentiment. She crafted characters that readers, specifically white Northern readers, could connect with and weep for. She told the story of Tom, a noble, devoutly Christian slave who endures unimaginable suffering without losing his faith. She told the story of Eliza, a young mother who, upon learning her son is to be sold, makes a desperate, heart-stopping dash for freedom across the cracking ice of the Ohio River. And she gave the North a villain to hate, the cruel, sadistic, and, importantly, Northern-born slave driver Simon Legree, a monster who embodied the corrupting influence of the slave system. For hundreds of thousands of readers, this was the first time they had been forced to confront the emotional reality of slavery. It wasn't about economics or states' rights anymore. It was about a mother's love for her child. It was about the destruction of the family, the one institution 19th century Americans held more sacred than any other. The book was an emotional sledgehammer, and it hit its target with devastating precision. It bypassed the brain and went straight for the heart, leaving a trail of tears, righteous anger, and hardened resolve in its wake. The reaction was as divided as the country itself. In the North, it was a sensation. People who had been on the fence about slavery were horrified. It turned passive dislike into active opposition. It fueled the abolitionist movement like nothing before, giving them their most powerful piece of propaganda. It became the moral textbook for a generation of young Northerners who would eventually march south to fight the Civil War. In the South, the reaction was apoplectic rage. They denounced the book as a pack of malicious, slanderous lies written by an ignorant Northern woman who knew nothing of their way of life. They called it abolitionist propaganda disguised as a novel. The book was banned, and in some places it was publicly burned. In a bizarre attempt at literary counter-programming, Southern authors churned out dozens of anti-Tom novels with titles like Aunt Phyllis's Cabin or Southern Life as It Is, which all painted a rosy picture of happy, well-cared-for slaves who loved their benevolent masters and had no desire for freedom. Unsurprisingly, these books failed to convince anyone who wasn't already a true believer. Personified dialogue North, sniffling, clutching a tear-stained copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. My God, I just finished it. Simon Legree, what he did to Tom, and little Eva. It's an abomination, a sin against heaven itself. South, scoffs, sipping bourbon. Oh, here we go. You've been poisoned by that Beecher woman's hysterical scribblings. It's fiction, a complete and utter fabrication designed to slander us. North. Fabrication? She based it on real accounts. The slave auctions, the beatings, the separation of families. You can't tell me that doesn't happen. South. Our servants are the happiest, best cared for laboring class in the world. They are part of our family. We provide for them from cradle to grave. That book is a caricature, a grotesque distortion of our paternal institution. You are a fool to believe it. North. I believe my conscience. And my conscience is telling me that this system you're so proud of is a moral cancer. After reading this, how can we be the same country? South. That for once is an excellent question. And that was the true, lasting impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It fundamentally changed the nature of the debate. A political problem can be compromised on. An economic disagreement can be negotiated. But a moral crusade? That's a fight to the death. The book drew a clear line in the sand. On one side were those who saw slavery as a profound evil. On the other were those who saw the attack on slavery as an attack on their home, their honor, and their God. There's a famous, though likely embellished story that when Abraham Lincoln finally met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." While not literally true, it speaks to a deeper truth. The book had made the conflict irreconcilable. It had given the North a righteous cause and the South a profound sense of persecution. The middle ground was vanishing, burned away by the fire of a single powerful story. After Harriet Beecher Stowe dropped her emotional bomb on the nation, the North and South were no longer just roommates in a political dispute. They were ex-lovers living in the same house, communicating only through angry, tear-stained notes slid under the door. The moral chasm between them had become immense, and into this chasm, a politician from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas decided it would be a fantastic idea to build a railroad. Douglas was a force of nature. Nicknamed the Little Giant, he was short in stature but a colossus of ambition, energy, and political maneuvering. He was a Democrat, a ferocious patriot, and a true believer in westward expansion. More than anything, he wanted to stitch the country together, from Atlantic to Pacific, with the iron thread of a transcontinental railroad. And, not coincidentally, he wanted the starting point of that railroad to be in Chicago, the booming metropolis of his home state. A Chicago-based railroad would make his state rich, cement the unity of the nation, and most importantly, clear his path directly to the White House. There was just one tiny problem. The proposed route for his railroad ran directly through a massive, unorganized chunk of land directly west of Missouri. This was the last unincorporated part of the Louisiana Purchase, a vast area known as the Nebraska Territory. To build a railroad, you need towns, supplies, and legal authority, which meant the territory had to be officially organized by Congress. And here's where Douglas hit the great sectional brick wall. According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that sacred 34-year-old agreement, this entire territory was north of the 3630 line. It was, by law, free soil. Any state carved out of it would have to be a free state. Douglas, a pragmatist to his core, knew the Southern senators would never, ever vote to create a gigantic new free territory that would one day become 1, 2, or even 3 more free states. They'd filibuster his beloved railroad into oblivion. His path to glory was blocked by the South's intractable defense of slavery. So, the little giant decided to get clever. He would offer the South a deal so good they couldn't possibly refuse. He would give them a chance to win something they had legally lost decades ago. His solution was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Here was the plan. First, the bill would take that massive territory and chop it in two: a northern part, Nebraska, and a southern part, Kansas, which sat right on the western border of the slave state of Missouri. Second, and this was the stick of dynamite, the bill would explicitly repeal the Missouri Compromise. That line on the map, the one that had kept a semblance of peace for a generation, would be erased. In its place, Douglas substituted his favorite political cure-all, popular sovereignty. "Let the people rule," he thundered. "Let the actual, honest-to-goodness settlers who moved to Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves, via a democratic vote, whether they want their new home to be slave or free." To Douglas, this was the perfect, democratic American solution. It took the explosive issue out of the hands of meddling politicians in Washington and gave it to the pioneers on the ground. It was fair, it was modern, and most importantly, it would get him the Southern votes he needed for his railroad. He thought he was a genius. He thought he'd found the magic formula to solve the slavery question forever. He was catastrophically, biblically wrong. The North reacted with a level of fury that shocked even seasoned politicians. This wasn't a compromise. It was a complete and total surrender to the slave power. Douglas, a Northern senator, was proposing to tear up a sacred, time-honored pact to open up free land to the blight of slavery. Protests erupted across the free states. Newspapers called it an atrocious plot. Ministers condemned it from the pulpit. A group of senators published an appeal calling it a gross violation of a sacred pledge that would subject the territory to a deadly struggle between freedom and slavery. They were right. Personified dialogue. Stephen Douglas, standing on a podium beaming. "My friends, I present the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a masterpiece of democratic principle. We shall organize the West, build a magnificent railroad to the Pacific, and settle the slavery question once and for all by trusting the people. Popular sovereignty." The North, staring aghast, face turning purple with rage. Are you kidding me? You're repealing the Missouri Compromise? The one thing that was keeping this powder keg from exploding for a train? Douglas, it's an outdated, arbitrary line on a map. The principle of popular sovereignty is far more consistent with our institutions. Besides, I have it on good authority that the soil and climate of Kansas are inhospitable to the plantation economy. It'll almost certainly vote to be a free state anyway. The North. So you set our sacred promise on fire for a symbolic gesture. You've just invited every slaveholder in Missouri to cross the border and stuff the ballot boxes. You haven't solved the problem. You've created a battleground. You've literally given them a how-to guide for expanding slavery. Douglas, nonsense. I have faith in the American people to settle this peacefully at the polls. You're being hysterical. And that was Douglas's fatal miscalculation. He was a politician, and he saw slavery as a political problem, a matter of property rights and local regulation that could be managed. But for a growing number of Northerners, it was no longer a political problem. It was a sin. It was a moral cancer. And you don't vote on cancer. You don't apply popular sovereignty to a malignant tumor. You cut it out. By repealing the Missouri Compromise, Douglas had inadvertently destroyed the very ground upon which political compromise could stand. He thought he was building a railroad, but he was actually just handing both sides a shovel and pointing them to a flat, open piece of land called Kansas. "Here," the act seemed to say, "this is where you're going to have your fight." And the fight was coming. Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act wasn't a piece of legislation. It was a starting pistol. The moment it became law, the race was on. The lofty democratic ideal of popular sovereignty immediately devolved into a frantic, high-stakes scramble to see which side could flood the Kansas territory with more voters. It was a political land rush, and both sides were determined to win by any means necessary. From the north came the Free Staters. Funded by abolitionist groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Company, thousands of anti-slavery settlers packed their belongings and headed west. They weren't just pioneers looking for a patch of dirt to farm. They were missionaries for a cause, armed with what were nicknamed Beecher's Bibles, not actual books but Sharp's rifles, which the fiery abolitionist preacher Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, had famously declared to be a greater moral force against slavery than 1,000 Bibles. They established staunchly anti-slavery towns like Lawrence and Topeka, ready to vote Kansas into the Union as a free state. The pro-slavery side had a much shorter commute. The slave state of Missouri sat right on Kansas's eastern border, and its citizens were not about to let a bunch of psalm-singing Yankees steal what they considered their rightful backyard. These were the border ruffians, a term that perfectly captures their vibe. Led by charismatic demagogues like Senator David Atchison, who allegedly told his followers to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the district, these men were ready to defend slavery with their fists, their knives, and their votes, whether they were legal Kansas residents or not. The first test of popular sovereignty came with the election for the territorial legislature in March 1855, and it was a complete and utter sham. On election day, an army of some 5,000 border ruffians swaggered across the border from Missouri, got drunk, voted, often multiple times at different polling places, and then rode home, leaving behind a completely fraudulent, overwhelmingly pro-slavery legislature. The legitimate anti-slavery settlers in Kansas were outvoted by a factor of about 5-1. This new, bogus legislature, as the Free Staters called it, immediately convened and passed a series of laws that were almost a parody of pro-slavery fanaticism. They made it a felony, punishable by 2 years of hard labor, to even question the legality of slavery in Kansas. Assisting a fugitive slave was now a capital offense. You could be legally executed for giving a thirsty person a drink of water if that person was an escaped slave. The Free State settlers, naturally, refused to recognize this clown show of a government. They declared the election a fraud, held their own illegal election, drafted their own anti-slavery constitution, and established a rival government in Topeka. So by 1856, Kansas had 2 illegal governments, 2 competing populations that despised each other on a cellular level, and a whole lot of guns. Stephen Douglas's democratic experiment had created a failed state before the state had even been created. The situation was no longer political, it was combustible. And then came the spark. In May 1856, a pro-slavery sheriff leading a posse of 800 border ruffians descended on the Free State stronghold of Lawrence to serve arrest warrants. This was just a pretext. What they really came to do was terrorize the town. They wrecked the offices of 2 abolitionist newspapers, throwing the printing presses into the river. They took a cannon and fired on the Free State Hotel, a large stone building they viewed as a fortress, before burning the empty structure to the ground. The sack of Lawrence was a largely bloodless act of political vandalism, but its symbolic impact was enormous. It was an open declaration of war, and it provoked a response of terrifying ferocity. News of the raid reached a man named John Brown. Brown was a radical abolitionist of a different breed. He was a stern, iron-willed Calvinist who believed himself to be a divine instrument, chosen by God to smite the wicked institution of slavery. He wasn't interested in moral suasion or political compromise. He was interested in divine retribution. Hearing of the sack of Lawrence and mistakenly believing 5 Free Staters had been killed, Brown declared that it was time for an eye for an eye. Border ruffian, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, rifle slung over his shoulder. Just got back from Lawrence, taught them Yankee scribblers a lesson. This here's gonna be a slave state, by God, just like Missouri. We ain't letting no psalm singers tell us how to live. Free Stater, cleaning his Sharp's rifle in his cabin. You burned a hotel and threw a printing press in a river. You call that a victory? You're thugs, not pioneers. This soil was meant for free men and their families, not for the chains of your backward system. Border ruffian. Call it what you want. We won the election, fair and square. Free Stater. You won an election with thousands of illegal votes from Missouri. We don't recognize your bogus laws or your bogus legislature. We have our own government. This is our home. Border ruffian. This is a war of extermination. You people came here to steal our property and our rights. We're here to see you run out of this territory one way or another. Free Stater. We're not the ones who are going to be running. 3 nights after the raid on Lawrence, John Brown, 4 of his sons, and a couple of other followers crept along the banks of Pottawatomie Creek. They went to the cabins of 5 pro-slavery settlers, men who were associated with the pro-slavery court, but were not slaveholders themselves. They dragged the unarmed men out into the darkness and, in a horrifying act of bloody vengeance, hacked them to death with broadswords. The Pottawatomie Massacre was an act of political terrorism that shocked the nation. It was a new level of savagery, and it was exactly what the situation didn't need. The massacre triggered a summer of brutal retaliatory guerrilla warfare. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery militias clashed. Towns were burned and settlers on both sides were murdered. The territory earned a new grim name: Bleeding Kansas. Stephen Douglas's beautiful theory of popular sovereignty had, in practice, turned the prairie red. This was no longer a debate. It was a pre-game brawl for the Civil War. The brutal low-grade Civil War in Kansas was horrifying enough, but it was still happening out there on the bloody frontier, 1,000 miles from the capital. It was easy for some in the marble halls of Washington, D.C. to dismiss it as a messy but distant squabble between hotheads and pioneers. That illusion of civilized detachment was about to be, quite literally, beaten to a bloody pulp. The violence of Bleeding Kansas was coming home, and it was about to make its grand debut on the floor of the United States Senate. Enter Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner was, in many ways, the walking, talking embodiment of the Northern intellectual elite. He was a Harvard graduate, a brilliant lawyer, a powerful orator, and a man so filled with righteous fury against slavery that he vibrated with it. He was also, by most accounts, insufferably arrogant, pompous, and utterly convinced of his own moral superiority. He wasn't a man who made friends easily. He made disciples, and he made enemies. And in May of 1856, he decided to make a few more enemies. As the nation was reeling from the news of the sack of Lawrence in Kansas, Sumner rose in the Senate to deliver a pre-prepared, 2-day-long speech he called "The Crime Against Kansas." It was not a measured political address. It was a 5-hour verbal flamethrower. Sumner unleashed a torrent of beautiful, eloquent, and incredibly vicious invective against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the South, and the institution of slavery. He wasn't just attacking their arguments. He was attacking them, personally. And he saved his most poisonous venom for an elderly, well-respected senator from South Carolina named Andrew Butler. Sumner mocked Butler, who was not present for the speech, as a Don Quixote figure. He made fun of Butler's speaking style, and even cruelly alluded to a physical infirmity Butler had suffered that sometimes caused him to drool. Then, he delivered the killing blow. He accused Senator Butler of taking a mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. In the 19th century, this was beyond the pale. You did not, under any circumstances, accuse another senator of keeping a prostitute and then compare that prostitute to his home state's most cherished institution. You were not only questioning his honor, you were spitting on his entire civilization. It was a verbal duel to the death. And in the South, when a man's honor was attacked so viciously, a response was not just expected, it was required. The response came not from Butler himself, but from his cousin, a young, hot-tempered congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks. Brooks was enraged. He saw Sumner's speech as a mortal insult to his family and his state. His first instinct was to challenge Sumner to a duel, the traditional method for gentlemen to settle matters of honor. But Brooks reasoned that Sumner, by using such coarse and ungentlemanly language, had proven he was no gentleman at all. You don't duel with social inferiors. You beat them. So Brooks decided he would publicly cane Sumner like a disobedient dog, right in the heart of the government. On May 22nd, 2 days after the speech, Brooks walked into the Senate chamber. The session had just ended, but Sumner remained at his desk, writing letters. Brooks approached, waited for the last of the women to leave the gallery, and then calmly said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina, and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Before Sumner could even process what was happening and begin to stand, Brooks raised a heavy cane made of gutta percha and brought it down with full force on Sumner's head. The attack was horrifically violent. Sumner's chair was bolted to the floor, trapping him. Blinded by his own blood, he struggled to get up while Brooks rained blow after blow down on his head and shoulders. The cane was so thick, it didn't break for nearly a minute of relentless beating. Sumner, a large man himself, finally managed to rip the entire desk from the floor with his thighs as he staggered to his feet, only to collapse unconscious in the aisle. Several other congressmen who had accompanied Brooks stood by, with at least one brandishing a pistol to prevent anyone from intervening. The caning only stopped when the cane itself shattered into a dozen pieces. Personified dialogue, a composite of reactions across the nation. The South, reading a newspaper with a headline, "Sumner put in his place. It's about time. Brooks is a hero." That abolitionist got exactly what was coming to him. You can't spew that kind of filth and expect to get away with it. This'll teach those Yankee fanatics to mind their tongues. Someone send that man a new cane. The North, reading a different newspaper with a headline, "Barbarism in the Senate." My God, they're savages. Absolute barbarians. This is what they call Southern chivalry. A congressman sneaks up on a seated man and tries to beat his brains out with a club for giving a speech. This isn't a government anymore. It's a mob. Freedom of speech is dead. They've silenced debate with a bludgeon. The reaction to the caning was a perfect snapshot of a nation that had lost its mind. In the South, Preston Brooks became an overnight hero. Admirers sent him hundreds of new canes to replace the one he had broken over Sumner's head, some with inscriptions like, "Hit him again." He was fined a paltry $300, resigned from Congress in a show of defiance, and was then immediately and overwhelmingly re-elected. In the North, the caning was seen as the ultimate proof that the South was a land of violent, backwards brutes who could not be reasoned with. Bleeding Sumner became a martyr for the anti-slavery cause, his empty Senate seat a silent testament to the barbarism of the slave power. He was so badly injured, he couldn't return to the Senate for over 3 years. The attack did more to create abolitionists in the North than Sumner's speech ever could have. It was the moment when political disagreement was officially replaced by physical violence, not on a dusty prairie, but in the supposed Temple of Liberty. The last pretense of civility had been shattered, along with Preston Brooks's cane. After the legislative branch of the United States government had been turned into a fight club, you might think the other branches would try to calm things down. Maybe the judicial branch, the 9 supposedly impartial, black-robed wise men of the Supreme Court, would step in as the voice of reason and legal sobriety. You would, of course, be hilariously, tragically wrong. Instead of putting out the fire, the Supreme Court, in one of the most infamous decisions in its entire history, decided to pick up a can of constitutional gasoline and spray it all over the smoldering embers. This legal catastrophe was called the Dred Scott decision. The story starts with a man named Dred Scott. Scott was enslaved in Missouri, but in the 1830s, his owner, an army surgeon, took him to live for extended periods in the free state of Illinois and in the Wisconsin Territory, a place where slavery had been explicitly banned by the Missouri Compromise. After his owner died, Scott, with the backing of anti-slavery lawyers, sued for his freedom. The argument was simple and had a basis in existing law. Once free, always free. By residing on free soil, Scott had been legally emancipated and could not be dragged back into slavery. The case spent a grueling 11 years winding its way through the American legal labyrinth, finally landing on the docket of the Supreme Court in 1856. At the helm of the court was Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, an 80-year-old Marylander who looked like a walking corpse, and held the legal opinions of a medieval inquisitor. A former slaveholder himself, Taney was a fierce defender of Southern rights, and he saw the Dred Scott case as a golden opportunity. He could have dismissed the case on a narrow technicality. Instead, he decided to swing for the fences. He and the court's Southern-dominated majority decided they would use this case to issue a sweeping, definitive final ruling that would solve the slavery question once and for all by constitutionally validating the most extreme pro-slavery arguments and crushing the anti-slavery movement forever. On March 6, 1857, just 2 days after the inauguration of the new pro-Southern President James Buchanan, Taney read the majority opinion from the bench. It was a legal broadside that detonated with the force of a bomb. The decision had 3 earth-shattering parts. First, Taney declared that Dred Scott could not even sue in federal court because he was not, and could never be, a citizen of the United States. Why? Because he was black. In the decision's most infamous passage, Taney wrote that at the time of the nation's founding, black people were regarded as beings of an inferior order, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. It didn't matter if they were enslaved or free. Citizenship was for whites only. This was a breathtakingly racist ruling that attempted to write white supremacy directly into the Constitution. That should have been the end of it. If Scott couldn't sue, the court had no jurisdiction. But Taney was just getting warmed up. He decided to keep going to settle the bigger questions. The second bombshell was that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the law that had banned slavery in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase for 37 years, was unconstitutional. His reasoning: slaves are property. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution protects a citizen's right to property. Therefore, Congress had no right to pass a law that deprived a slave owner of his property simply because he took it into a federal territory. Banning slavery in the territories was the legal equivalent of banning people from taking their pocket watches or their horses there. Bombshell number 3 followed logically from number 2. If Congress itself had no power to ban slavery in a territory, then it certainly couldn't delegate that power to a territorial government. This meant that the great democratic idea of popular sovereignty, the central pillar of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was also unconstitutional. The people of a territory had no right to vote to ban slavery. The impact was immediate and cataclysmic. In the South, there was jubilation. The highest court in the land had just handed them a total victory. It had declared that their property was protected by the Constitution everywhere. It had invalidated the core belief of the anti-slavery North. To them, the debate was over. They had won. Personified dialogue. Chief Justice Taney, gaveling in, his voice a dry rustle. Order. This court has reviewed the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Our ruling is as follows. Black people are not citizens and have no rights. The Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional because slaves are property, like your hat or your farm animals. Therefore, Congress cannot ban slavery anywhere in the territories. We have now definitively settled this divisive issue. The law has spoken. The North stands up in shock. Hold on. What did you just say? No rights? And we can't stop slavery from spreading anywhere? That's insane. That's not a legal ruling. That's a political manifesto written by slave owners. Chief Justice Taney, it is the supreme law of the land. Your new Republican Party, with its talk of free soil, is based on an unconstitutional premise. This court advises you to cease your agitation. The North. Agitation? You just declared the United States a slaveholding republic from coast to coast. You didn't settle the issue. You declared war on the very idea of freedom. We will not honor this ruling. It has no moral weight. It is a conspiracy, and we will defy it. In the North, the decision was a political earthquake that shattered any remaining faith in the federal government. The Supreme Court, the one institution that was supposed to be above politics, had just issued a transparently partisan, morally grotesque ruling. It seemed to confirm the North's worst fears, that the country was in the grip of a vast slave power conspiracy that controlled the presidency, Congress, and now the Supreme Court. The Republican Party's central platform, stopping the expansion of slavery, had just been declared unconstitutional. Far from ending the debate, Taney's decision poured fuel on the fire. It radicalized millions of Northerners, convincing them that the system was rigged and that legal, peaceful means of resisting slavery were now exhausted. The court had tried to kill the anti-slavery movement with a law book, but all it did was convince the North that the only thing left to use was a sword. The Dred Scott decision was a legal declaration of war, but declarations are just words on paper. What the country needed now was a man of action, a man so consumed with righteous fury that he was willing to trade words for swords and legal arguments for bullets. What the country needed was for John Brown to get back on the main stage. You remember John Brown, right? The avenging angel from Bleeding, Kansas, the guy who responded to a pro-slavery raid by dragging 5 men from their beds and hacking them to death with broadswords. Well, after his little excursion in Kansas, Brown had become a radical celebrity. He toured New England giving fiery speeches and collecting money from wealthy abolitionists who were thrilled by his willingness to meet violence with violence. But Brown wasn't collecting money for another prairie skirmish. He had something far grander, far more audacious, and far more insane in mind. He was planning to invade the South. His plan was as simple as it was delusional. He and a small army of disciples would attack and seize the federal armory and arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This wasn't just any armory. It was one of the largest weapons depots in the country, home to over 100,000 rifles and muskets. Brown's idea wasn't to steal the guns and run. He believed that his raid would be a trumpet blast that would awaken the enslaved population of Virginia. Slaves would hear of his daring act, rise up, abandon their plantations, and flock to his side. He would arm them with the arsenal's weapons and create a great army of liberation. This army, he imagined, would sweep south through the Appalachian Mountains, a moving fortress of freedom, freeing slaves as it went, until the entire rotten institution of slavery crumbled to dust. It was a holy vision. It was also, from a military standpoint, the plan of a complete madman. On the night of October 16, 1859, the plan went into motion. John Brown and his army, which consisted of 21 men, including 3 of his sons, a handful of other idealists, and 5 black freedom fighters, strolled into Harper's Ferry and captured the federal armory with barely a whisper. The place was guarded by a single unarmed night watchman. For a few brief hours, John Brown was in control of one of the most important military sites in the United States. He had his prize. And then, nothing happened. The crucial next step of the plan, the spontaneous massive slave uprising, failed to materialize. The local slaves were mostly confused, terrified, and utterly unwilling to join a bunch of heavily armed strangers in what looked like a suicide mission. Instead of grabbing the guns and making a run for the mountains as planned, Brown's raid stalled. His men took hostages, including a great-grandnephew of George Washington, and holed themselves up in the armory's small brick fire engine house. By morning, the town was awake. Local militias had surrounded them, and a furious gun battle had erupted. The final act was swift and brutal. The federal government, alerted by telegraph, dispatched a company of U.S. Marines under the command of a distinguished Army colonel named Robert E. Lee. On the morning of October 18th, Lee's Marines battered down the door of the engine house and stormed the building. The fight was over in 3 minutes. Most of Brown's raiders lay dead or dying. Brown himself was severely wounded by a saber slash and taken prisoner. His grand invasion was a catastrophic failure, but John Brown's true victory was about to begin. As a guerrilla commander, he was a flop. As a martyr, he was about to become a legend. He was put on trial for treason against Virginia, murder, and inciting slave insurrection. The trial was a national sensation. From his cot in the courtroom, Brown delivered some of the most eloquent and powerful condemnations of slavery ever spoken on American soil. He transformed himself from a failed terrorist into a noble prophet, an instrument of God who was being put to death for daring to fight for the enslaved. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, he said at his sentencing, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. He was hanged on December 2, 1859, the South, sweating, shaking with a mixture of terror and fury. A terrorist! You see, we told you the abolitionists sent this maniac to murder us in our sleep. He was trying to start a slave revolt, a race war. This is your beloved North. They cheer for a man who wanted to arm our servants and have them slit our throats. We are not safe. This union is a lie. The North. Deeply conflicted reading Brown's last words in the newspaper. The raid was a disaster, yes. It was ill-advised. But his motives, the man looked at the evil of slavery and, unlike the rest of us, he actually did something. He was willing to die to make men free. He's a fanatic, maybe, but he's our fanatic. He's a martyr to the cause of liberty. The South. A martyr? He's a murderer and a traitor. You're making a saint out of a man who broke every law of God and man. There's no reasoning with you people. If you see this monster as a hero, then we are two separate nations. This is the last straw. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was the single most polarizing event of the decade. It was the point of no return. For the South, it was their worst nightmare come to life. It confirmed every paranoid fantasy they had about the North's secret desire to violently destroy their way of life. The fact that prominent Northern intellectuals and writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau praised Brown as a saint only deepened their terror and rage. For the North, Brown's death sanctified the anti-slavery cause. While many condemned his violent methods, they admired his courage and his unwavering commitment. He had done what they had only talked about. On the day of his execution, church bells tolled across the North. He had failed to free a single slave, but he had succeeded in shattering any lingering hope of compromise. He had made the conflict a holy war. A new song was already being written, a song that Union soldiers would soon be singing as they marched south. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. The ghost of John Brown now haunted America. In the South, he was a boogeyman, the terrifying embodiment of Northern aggression. In the North, he was a martyred saint, a symbol of righteous, uncompromising opposition to slavery. His raid had acted as a massive accelerant, burning away the last flimsy hopes for a peaceful resolution. And this new, hardened, furiously anti-slavery Northern mood needed a political home. The old party system was simply not equipped to handle this level of existential rage. It was time for a glow-up. For decades, American politics had been dominated by two behemoths, the Democrats and the Whigs. A key feature of this system was that both parties were national. They had to build coalitions of Northern and Southern voters to win elections, which forced them into a constant, squishy, and often infuriating process of compromise on the issue of slavery. They papered over the cracks because neither party could afford to alienate its entire Southern or Northern wing. But after the 1-2-3 punch of the Kansas-Nebraska Act bleeding Kansas and the caning of Sumner, that system shattered. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the kill shot for the Whig Party. When it came up for a vote, Northern Whigs screamed betrayal and voted against it, while Southern Whigs, prioritizing the potential expansion of slavery over party loyalty, voted for it. The party cleaved itself in two right on the floor of Congress and bled out. It was a political fatality of the sectional crisis, leaving a massive power vacuum in the North. Millions of voters, former Whigs, disgusted anti-slavery Democrats, and single-issue Free Soilers, were now politically homeless. Into this chaos, a new political force was born, rising from the ashes of the old system like a strange hybrid phoenix. It was called the Republican Party, and it was founded in 1854 for one express purpose: to stop the spread of slavery. Period. It was a political Frankenstein's monster stitched together from the disparate parts of other movements. You had the economic nationalists of the old Whig Party who wanted federal support for industry and infrastructure. You had the moral fervor of the abolitionists. You had the land-hungry frontiersmen who wanted the West to be for free white laborers, not enslaved black people. It was a motley crew, but they were all united by a single galvanizing, non-negotiable principle. Slavery would not be allowed to expand into the Western territories by one more single inch. Their official position was a masterpiece of calculated moderation, designed to be as broadly appealing in the North as possible. Most Republicans were not, at this stage, abolitionists. They did not call for the immediate end of slavery where it already existed. In fact, they repeatedly stated that the Constitution protected slavery in the Southern states, and they had no legal right or intention to interfere with it there. Their argument was one of containment. Slavery, they argued, was a moral, social, and economic evil. It was a backwards feudal institution that degraded the dignity of labor and was antithetical to the nation's founding principles of liberty. Therefore, like a disease, it must be contained. They would draw a cordon sanitaire around the existing slave states and prevent the infection from spreading. They would, in the words of their most famous new member, Abraham Lincoln, place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. The North heard this and thought, that sounds reasonable. It was a firm moral stand that also happened to align perfectly with their economic interests. It was the perfect political product for the moment. The South heard this and went into a 5-alarm panic. They didn't hear the part about we won't touch slavery where it is. All they heard was ultimate extinction. The Republican platform, in their view, was a declaration of war. Their entire social and political framework was built on the belief that slavery had to expand to survive. To contain it was to slowly strangle it. A Republican victory would mean the entire executive branch of the federal government, the army, the post office, the patronage jobs, would be in the hands of a party that was openly hostile to their fundamental way of life. Personified dialogue. Republican Party. A fresh-faced, energetic newcomer nailing a poster to a tree. Hello, America. We're the new Republican Party. Our platform is simple. Free soil, free labor, free men. We believe slavery is a national problem, and while we can't touch it in the South, we are putting our foot down. No more new slave states. We are building a firewall. The South, peeking out from behind a curtain looking horrified. A firewall? You mean a cage? You're saying our entire society is a plague that you want to quarantine. You're threatening our property, our prosperity, and our future. Republican Party, we're not threatening your existing property. We're just saying you can't move it into the new, shared parts of the house. We want those rooms to be for free, hard-working families, not for you and your peculiar institution. The South. This is an act of aggression. You are a purely sectional party. You don't exist down here. You represent the fanatical North and nothing else. If your party ever takes the White House, it will not be our government. It will be the government of a foreign hostile power, and we will not live under such tyranny. This is what made the rise of the Republican Party so revolutionary and so dangerous. For the first time, America had a major political party that was purely sectional. Its base of support was entirely in the North. It could, theoretically, win the presidency without a single vote from a single Southern state. And the South knew it. The election of a Republican president was, for them, the ultimate red line. It would be proof that they had permanently lost control of their own destiny within the Union. The political system was no longer a forum for national compromise. It had become a winner-take-all battle for the soul of the country. And the biggest battle of all was just around the corner, the election of 1860, with the Republican Party now a political juggernaut in the North, and the South swearing that the election of a Republican president would be grounds for secession. The election year of 1860 dawned with a sense of apocalyptic dread. The one and only institution that stood a chance of holding the country together was the Democratic Party. It was the last truly national political party, the final fraying rope in a furious game of tug-of-war. And in the spring of 1860, the Democrats gathered for their national convention and proceeded to take that rope, douse it in kerosene, and set it on fire. The setting for this act of spectacular self-immolation could not have been more perfectly chosen. Charleston, South Carolina. This was not neutral ground. This was the ideological heart of the Confederacy before the Confederacy even existed. It was a city simmering with secessionist fever, a place where radical pro-slavery fire-eaters were the mainstream. Sending Northern delegates into this cauldron of Southern nationalism to try and hammer out a compromise was like hosting a peace conference in the middle of an active volcano. The party arrived in Charleston already split into two warring factions, each with a completely non-negotiable demand. On one side were the Northern Democrats, led by their champion, the Little Giant, Stephen A. Douglas. Their position was popular sovereignty. They argued that Douglas was the only Democrat who could possibly win any free states, and popular sovereignty, however flawed, was the only platform they could sell back home. It was their last desperate attempt at a middle ground. On the other side were the Southern Democrats, the fire eaters, drunk on the victory of the Dred Scott decision. For them, popular sovereignty was now an insult, a cowardly betrayal of their rights. The Supreme Court had spoken. Slavery was legal in all the territories. Therefore, they demanded that the official party platform include a plank calling for a federal slave code, a law to be passed by the U.S. Congress that would actively and aggressively protect the institution of slavery in any territory, regardless of what the settlers who lived there wanted. It was a demand for total victory, a constitutional sledgehammer to crush any and all anti-slavery sentiment in the West. The convention opened and the platform debate began. It was not a debate, it was a brawl. The Southerners, led by the famously eloquent and fanatical Alabamian William Lowndes Yancey, made it clear this was an ultimatum. They presented their slave code plank. The Northern delegates, knowing this would be the electoral equivalent of taping a kick-me sign to their backs in every county north of the Ohio River, used their superior numbers to vote it down. They instead passed a platform that vaguely supported the Supreme Court's decisions while still winking at popular sovereignty. For the fire eaters, this was the ultimate act of treachery. Yancey rose and delivered a thunderous speech, declaring that the Northern Democrats were no better than the hated Black Republicans. And then, he and the entire Alabama delegation stood up and walked out of the convention hall. In a stunning display of sectional solidarity, the delegations from Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, Arkansas, and Georgia followed them out into the Charleston night. The party had officially ruptured. The remaining delegates, mostly Northerners, were left stunned. They tried to proceed with the nomination, but the rules required a 2/3 majority of all original delegates, not just those left in the room. Stephen Douglas had a clear majority of those remaining, but he couldn't get over the 2/3 threshold. After 57 ballots with no winner in sight, the exhausted, demoralized convention admitted defeat. They agreed to adjourn and try again in 6 weeks in the hopefully less insane city of Baltimore. Northern Democrat. Frantically, sweating through his suit in the Charleston heat. For the love of God, be reasonable. Douglas is our only shot. We have to unite behind him and popular sovereignty, or the Republicans are going to sweep the North and Lincoln will be president. Southern Democrat, calmly adjusting his cravat. We find your definition of reasonable to be lacking. The Supreme Court has affirmed our constitutional right to the protection of our property in the federal territories. Your popular sovereignty is nothing but mob rule. We demand that the party stand for the law. We demand a federal slave code. Northern Democrat. A slave code? We can't win a single dog-catcher election in Pennsylvania on that platform. It's suicide. You're asking us to hand the election to Lincoln. Southern Democrat. We are asking you to stand by the Constitution. If you refuse, it proves what we have long suspected. You are not our allies. You are simply Republicans who lack the courage of your convictions. This is our line in the sand. You are either with us or against us. Northern Democrat. This is madness. You're destroying the party. You're destroying the country. Southern Democrat. On the contrary, we are purifying the party. And if the country must be destroyed to protect our rights, then so be it. The Baltimore Convention was an even bigger circus. Competing delegations from the seceded states showed up, leading to endless credential fights. The whole thing collapsed again. The Southern fire eaters stormed out a second time. This time, it was final. The two broken pieces of the Democratic Party then held their own separate conventions. The regulars, composed almost entirely of Northerners, officially nominated Stephen A. Douglas. The Southern Democrats, meeting in their own hall, nominated the sitting Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a platform demanding a federal slave code. The last great national political party in America had successfully ripped itself to shreds. The Southern Fire Eaters, in their quest for total ideological purity, had knowingly and willingly split their own party, thereby guaranteeing the victory of the one candidate whose election they considered to be an act of war. It was perhaps the most stunningly successful act of political self-destruction in American history. The path to Abraham Lincoln's election was now wide open. The spectacular implosion of the Democratic Party had turned the 1860 presidential election from a political contest into a national game of Russian roulette. The last party of compromise was now a smoking crater, leaving the field open for the purely sectional forces to have their final, apocalyptic showdown. The stage was set for the most consequential election in American history, and it wasn't going to be a simple two-man race. It was a chaotic four-way battle royale for the soul of a rapidly disintegrating nation. First, you had the Republicans. Meeting in Chicago, they knew they had a golden opportunity. Instead of nominating their most famous but also most radical leader, William H. Seward, they made a shrewd calculation. They needed a candidate who looked like a moderate, someone who could win the crucial swing states of the lower north. They settled on a lanky, self-made lawyer from their host state of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was perfect. He was a former Whig, he was eloquent, he had a compelling life story, and his position on slavery was the party's sweet spot. He personally thought it was a moral evil, but his public platform was simply the firm, unyielding containment of it. No expansion. That's it. Then you had the shattered Democrats. In one corner, representing the northern wing, was Stephen A. Douglas. The little giant was finally his party's nominee, but the party was now a sinking ship. He ran on his battered and bruised platform of popular sovereignty, a desperate plea for a middle path that no one was walking on anymore. To his credit, Douglas was the only candidate who seemed to grasp the terrifying stakes. He undertook a grueling campaign tour, including in the hostile South, not just to get elected, but to practically beg the country to stay together. In the other corner, representing the Southern Democrats, was John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the current vice president. He was the standard bearer for the Fire Eaters, running on a platform that demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories, as dictated by the Dred Scott decision. He was the candidate of Southern ultimatums. And finally, because three factions weren't confusing enough, a fourth party emerged from the ether. They called themselves the Constitutional Union Party. This was basically a retirement home for old, terrified Whigs and moderates from the border states who looked at the Republicans and the Breckinridge Democrats and saw two sides of the same apocalyptic coin. Led by John Bell of Tennessee, their entire platform was, and I am not making this up, to vaguely uphold the Constitution of the country, the union of the states, and the enforcement of the laws. It was the political equivalent of shouting, "Can't we all just get along?" into the teeth of a hurricane. What followed was not one election, but two completely separate ones happening in parallel. In the North, the real fight was between Lincoln and Douglas. The other two were irrelevant. In the South, the real fight was between the radical Breckinridge and the moderate Bell. Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. This was the ultimate proof of the nation's schism. The leading presidential candidate in one half of the country did not even exist as an option in the other. Throughout the campaign, the South laid its cards on the table. There was no bluffing, no hidden meaning. The message from politicians and newspapers was terrifyingly clear. If Abraham Lincoln, the Black Republican, wins the presidency, the Union is over. We will leave. On November 6, 1860, America voted. The results came in, and the South's worst nightmare came true. Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency. But the details of his victory are what poured salt in the wound. Lincoln won a commanding majority in the Electoral College, but he did so with only 40% of the popular vote. He was a minority president. And most devastatingly, he had won without a single electoral vote from a southern state. He had won by completely dominating the populous North and the West Coast. The election was a perfect demographic map of the country's division. The North, with its superior population, had imposed its will on the South and had elected a president the South viewed as a mortal enemy. Personified dialogue. The North, celebrating, waving a newspaper. Victory! Lincoln is president. We did it. We finally wrestled control of the government from the slave power. It's a new era. The South, standing stone-faced, holding a packed satchel. You have elected a president. You have not elected our president. You have achieved this victory without our consent and against our will. The North. Oh, come on, don't be so dramatic. It was a democratic election. Lincoln won fair and square. He's promised he won't touch slavery where it is. Just wait and see. The South. Wait and see. We see a party dedicated to our ultimate extinction, now in control of the U.S. Army and the entire federal government. You did not elect a president. You installed a sectional tyrant. We gave you our ultimatum and you ignored it. This compact is hereby dissolved. We are no longer part of your country. The election of 1860 was the last straw. For the white South, the result was proof positive that they had lost all power, all voice, and all security within the Union. Their system, their society, their property, was now at the mercy of a hostile political party that had been put into power exclusively by their enemies. They didn't see Lincoln as a legitimate president. They saw him as the leader of a foreign conquest. The time for talking, for voting, for compromising was over. The democratic process had rendered its verdict, and since the verdict was not the one they wanted, they decided to simply quit the game and take their ball and their entire half of the country and go home. The season of secession was about to begin. The election of Abraham Lincoln was the starting gun. The South had promised secession if he won, and now it was time to see if they were bluffing. As it turned out, one state wasn't just not bluffing. It had been sitting by the front door with its bags packed for 30 years, just waiting for the excuse to storm out. That state, of course, was South Carolina. If the United States was a dysfunctional family, South Carolina was the perpetually aggrieved, overly dramatic drama queen who threatens to run away from home every time she's asked to do the dishes. This was the state of John C. Calhoun, the state that had cooked up the theory of nullification in the 1830s, claiming it could just ignore federal laws it didn't like. It had the most radical, pro-slavery, aristocratic political culture in the entire country. For decades, its politicians had spoken of secession not as a tragic last resort, but as a glorious destiny. For them, the Union wasn't a sacred pact. It was a restrictive business arrangement that had long since outlived its usefulness. When the telegraph wires buzzed with the news of Lincoln's victory on November 6, 1860, the city of Charleston did not weep. It erupted in celebration. This was it. This was the moment. The hated abolitionists had finally gone too far, and now the South had the perfect, unimpeachable reason to leave. There were fireworks, parades, and jubilant speeches. People proudly wore blue cockades on their hats, the symbol of secession. Within days, the state's federal officials resigned in protest. The state legislature, without a moment's hesitation, called for a special convention to be elected, whose one and only job was to decide on the relationship between South Carolina and the United States. Nobody had any doubt what the outcome would be. The election for delegates to this convention was a total rout for the secessionists. The cooperationists, those few who argued that South Carolina should wait and secede only in cooperation with other southern states, were swept away in a tidal wave of revolutionary fervor. The convention assembled in mid-December, and after a brief move from Columbia to Charleston to escape a smallpox outbreak, the delegates got down to the business of dissolving the country. There was no real debate. The decision had already been made in the hearts and minds of the state's ruling class years ago. This was just the formal paperwork. On December 20th, 1860, in a solemn ceremony at St. Andrew's Hall, the 169 delegates of the South Carolina Secession Convention voted. The result was unanimous, 169 to 0. With that vote, they passed a simple 174-word Ordinance of Secession. It declared that the Ordinance of 1788, by which South Carolina had ratified the U.S. Constitution, was hereby repealed, and that the union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states, under the name of the United States of America, is hereby dissolved. Just like that, in its own mind, South Carolina was no longer part of the United States. It was a free and independent country. A few days later, the convention published a longer document to explain its actions to the world, titled The Declaration of the Immediate Causes Which Induce and Justify the Secession of South Carolina. And for anyone, then or now, who wants to argue that this was about anything other than slavery, this document is a brutal, inconvenient, and undeniable refutation. The authors don't hide the ball. They put it on a tee and hit it with a driver. The document is an itemized list of complaints, and every single one is about the North's hostility to slavery. It rails against the northern states for not returning fugitive slaves. It complains about the rise of abolitionist societies. It condemns the northern states for denying the rights of property established in 15 of the states. And it points to the election of Lincoln as the final straw, stating that a man has been elected whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, and that the North now believes that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. The document's conclusion is crystal clear. We, therefore, the people of South Carolina, have solemnly declared that the union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is dissolved. Personified dialogue. South Carolina, stomping toward the door, throwing a suitcase onto the porch. I'm gone! I've had it! You've broken the contract. You elected the ape from Illinois. I am officially a sovereign nation. Long live the Palmetto Republic. A border state, like Kentucky. Nervously. Whoa, now, Carolina, let's not be rash. Lincoln hasn't even taken office. He hasn't done anything. You're leaving the family because you're afraid of something he might do? South Carolina. Afraid? This isn't fear, it's principle. They have declared war upon our institutions. Their entire political platform is an insult to our way of life. To stay in this union is to accept subjugation. I choose liberty. Kentucky. You choose chaos. This is treason. You're going to tear the whole house down just because your guy didn't win an election. South Carolina. This was not an election. It was a revolution. And now we shall have ours. I'm leaving. Now who has the courage to come with me? This was not a sad, reluctant departure. This was a joyous, defiant leap into what they believed would be a glorious new future. As the president of the convention announced the unanimous vote, the crowd in Charleston went wild. Church bells rang, cannons boomed, and people danced in the streets. They saw themselves as the heroic sons of the founding fathers, throwing off the yoke of a tyrannical government just as their ancestors had thrown off the yoke of King George III. They were convinced that their stand was so righteous, so clearly justified, that the other slave states would have no choice but to follow them out the door. South Carolina had slammed the door on the Union and now stood alone, waiting expectantly for its sisters to join the rebellion. The fuse had been lit. South Carolina had thrown down the gauntlet, performing the political equivalent of storming out of a party, slamming the door, and waiting on the lawn to see who would follow. For a few tense weeks, it stood alone, a defiant republic of 2 million palmetto trees and about 400,000 enslaved people, laved. The question hanging over the fractured nation was whether this was a solo act of madness or the start of a revolution. The Deep South quickly provided the answer. The secession of South Carolina wasn't a spark, it was a detonation, and the shockwave was about to rip through the Cotton Kingdom. The other states in the Deep South, tied to South Carolina by the twin bonds of cotton and slavery, now faced a stark choice: stay in a union governed by a man they despised, or cast their lot with their sister state in a bold, terrifying leap into the unknown. The momentum, fueled by decades of paranoia and a fresh surge of post-election panic, was overwhelming. The fire eaters, who had been fringe radicals just a few years earlier, were now the prophets of a new Southern nationalism. The snowball began to roll. Mississippi went next. On January 9, 1861, it became the second state to secede. If South Carolina's justification was a slightly legalistic argument about constitutional compacts, Mississippi's was a blunt instrument of pure, unadulterated white supremacy. Their Declaration of Immediate Causes is perhaps the most honest document of the entire era. It states with zero ambiguity, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. They weren't hiding the ball. They were proudly displaying it as the cornerstone of their new nation. The dominoes began to fall with breathtaking speed. The very next day, January 10th, Florida voted to leave. The day after that, January 11th, Alabama followed suit, urged on by its native son, the arch-secessionist William Yancey, who was finally seeing his life's dream realized. In less than a month, a block of 4 states had torn themselves from the Union. The real prize, however, was Georgia. The Empire State of the South, Georgia was the region's most populous and economically powerful state. Its decision was pivotal. If Georgia stayed, the secession movement might be contained. There was a genuine, fierce debate here. Powerful voices like the future Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, argued passionately against immediate secession, pleading with his fellow Georgians to wait, to try and wring concessions from the North, to not plunge the nation into a war they might lose. But the tide of secessionist fury was too strong. On January 19th, Georgia voted to leave. Its departure was a mortal blow to the Union, signaling that this was no mere fringe movement. This was the heart of the South breaking away. The avalanche continued. Louisiana, with its vital port of New Orleans controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, seceded on January 26th. And then on February 1st, the massive state of Texas voted to leave. The state's legendary governor, Sam Houston, who had fought to bring Texas into the Union, was a staunch Unionist and refused to accept secession. He was deposed from office for his defiance, a tragic icon of a Southern loyalty that was rapidly vanishing. So, let's recap. In the 6 weeks between December 20th, 1860, and February 1st, 1861, 7 states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had all formally declared themselves to be sovereign, independent nations. The United States of America was quite literally disintegrating, 1 star at a time. This was not a coordinated conspiracy so much as a chain reaction of fear, the fear that if they didn't all leave together, they would be conquered individually. Fear that Lincoln and his black Republicans really were coming to abolish slavery, destroy their economy, and enforce racial equality at the point of a bayonet. Personified dialogue. South Carolina. On the lawn, beckoning eagerly. The air of freedom is magnificent. Come on, Mississippi, Florida. Join the party. Don't let the abolitionists bully you. Mississippi, jumping off the porch. We're with you. This is for slavery and white supremacy. Let's go. Georgia, hesitating in the doorway. I don't know, fellas. This feels rash. What if we just wait? Lincoln is a moderate, maybe we can strike a bargain. Alabama, shoving past Georgia. A bargain with the devil? Never. They have insulted our honor and threatened our property. To wait is to submit. Are you a southern state or a northern colony? Louisiana, the cotton must flow. The river must be ours. We're out. Texas, Sam Houston is telling us to stay, but the people have spoken. We ride with the South. Georgia, sighing, finally stepping outside. Fine, fine. I'm in. But mark my words, this is going to end in a fight and we're bringing a penknife to a gunfight. And where was the federal government during this unprecedented national collapse? It was paralyzed. The man in the White House was not Abraham Lincoln, who was stuck in Illinois, a president-elect with no power. The man in charge was the lame duck president, James Buchanan, who was about to enter the pantheon of America's worst presidents. Buchanan's position on secession was a masterpiece of constitutional paralysis. He declared that, yes, secession was illegal, but he then concluded the federal government had no constitutional authority to use force to prevent a state from seceding. It was the political equivalent of a parent telling their child, "It's against the rules to run away from home, but I am legally forbidden from locking the door." This colossal failure of leadership created a power vacuum, and the seceding states rushed to fill it, confident that no one would or could stop them. While 7 southern states were busy voting themselves out of existence and forming a new slavery-based republic, a logical person might ask, where the hell was the President of the United States? The answer is that he was in the White House, wringing his hands, consulting law books, and presiding over the most pathetic, paralyzed, lame duck administration in American history. Meet James Buchanan, the man whose presidency consisted of watching the country catch fire and then issuing a formal statement declaring that while arson is illegal, the Constitution, unfortunately, does not provide for the use of fire extinguishers. This period between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861 is known as the Secession Winter, and it was a 4-month masterclass in the failure of leadership. James Buchanan was, to put it mildly, the wrong man at the wrong time. He was an elderly career politician, a doughface, a Northern Democrat who had built his entire career on appeasing the South. His cabinet was a viper's nest of secessionists and Southern sympathizers. His Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, spent his final weeks in office literally shipping federal cannons south before resigning to join the Confederacy. Buchanan was a man who craved consensus in a nation that no longer had one. He was the world's most exhausted substitute teacher left in charge of a classroom that had just erupted into a riot, and his only goal was to not get hit by a desk before the bell rang and the real teacher, Mr. Lincoln, showed up. In his final message to Congress in December 1860, with South Carolina already halfway out the door, Buchanan laid out his official position on the crisis, and it was a jaw-dropping piece of political and legal gymnastics. First, he declared that secession was unambiguously illegal. A state had no constitutional right to just up and leave the Union. It was, he said, an act of revolution. Okay, strong start. But then came the pivot. In the very next breath, he argued that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no constitutional power to use force or coerce a state to make it stay. Let that sink in. He was essentially telling the South, what you are doing is a crime, a very serious crime. However, I am a police officer who is constitutionally forbidden from arresting anyone, so please stop. Pretty please. This was not a policy. It was an engraved invitation to leave. It was a giant, flashing green light for the secessionists. The President of the United States had just announced that he was powerless to stop them. And so, the seceding states went on a looting spree. They didn't just pass ordinances. They began to actively seize federal property within their borders. They took over post offices, customs houses, and, most importantly, U.S. arsenals and forts, confiscating tens of thousands of federal rifles and cannons. And Buchanan did absolutely nothing. His strategy, if you can call it that, was to avoid any action that might provoke the South. He was terrified that if he so much as sneezed in their direction, it would push the wavering upper South states into the secessionist camp. He hoped that if he was patient and calm, the prodigal sons of the South would come to their senses and return to the family. This was like trying to calm a charging rhinoceros by offering it a nice cup of chamomile tea. Every act of appeasement was seen not as goodwill, but as weakness, further emboldening the rebels. The one place where he drew a wobbly line in the sand was Charleston Harbor. He refused South Carolina's demand to evacuate the federal troops from the forts there, but even this was a case of doing the bare minimum. As the tiny federal garrison under Major Robert Anderson moved to the more defensible Fort Sumter, they were desperately in need of supplies and reinforcements. Buchanan finally, reluctantly, agreed to send help. But instead of sending a warship, he sent the Star of the West, an unarmed civilian steamship. As the ship tried to enter Charleston Harbor in January 1861, cadets from the Citadel, a South Carolina military college, fired cannons at it. The unarmed ship, having been shot at by college kids, promptly turned around and sailed home. The United States government had just been punked and had run away. Personified dialogue unionist advisor. Mr. President, they're taking everything. They've seized the arsenal in Baton Rouge, the Mint in New Orleans. They fired on a U.S. flag. You are the commander-in-chief. You must respond with force. James Buchanan, peering over his spectacles at a law book. But the esteemed legal scholars are quite clear on this. The Constitution does not grant the executive the power to wage war against a state. To do so would be to violate the very document I swore to uphold. It would be coercion. Unionist advisor. Sir, with all due respect, they are waging war on us. They are stealing our property. This isn't coercion, it's self-defense. If we project nothing but weakness, they'll think they can get away with anything. Buchanan sighs heavily. This is a matter for Congress to decide, and for Mr. Lincoln to handle. It is a most unfortunate business. I shall pray for a peaceful resolution. My conscience is clear. I have followed the law. Buchanan wasn't a traitor. He was something far more frustrating. A timid, legalistic bureaucrat trying to apply the rules of a board game to a street fight. He was so terrified of overstepping his constitutional authority that he failed to use any authority at all. His inaction was a catastrophic failure of leadership. This 4-month interregnum was the crucial window in which the Confederacy was allowed to be born, to organize a government, to write a constitution, and to seize the military assets it would soon use to kill U.S. soldiers, all without a shred of federal resistance. Buchanan didn't cause the Civil War, but his colossal paralysis ensured that when it came, the Union would be in the worst possible position to fight it. While President Buchanan was busy perfecting the art of presidential paralysis, and the Deep South was on a secessionist joyride, there were still some people in Washington trying desperately to put the brakes on the national train wreck. With the executive branch completely useless, the legislative branch decided to give compromise one last frantic college try. This was the moment for a hero, a new great compromiser, to step into the void and magically glue the country back together. The man who tried to wear that mantle was John J. Crittenden. Crittenden was a distinguished, elderly senator from the border state of Kentucky. He was a political fossil from an earlier era, a disciple of the legendary Henry Clay, a man who believed with every fiber of his being that there was no political problem so great that it couldn't be solved with a bit of horse trading and a cleverly drawn line on a map. Representing a state that would be geographically and emotionally torn in half by a civil war, he was arguably the most motivated man in America to find a peaceful solution. In late December 1860, with South Carolina already gone and Mississippi packing its bags, Crittenden unveiled his grand plan to save the Union. This wasn't just another law. Crittenden was proposing a series of unamendable constitutional amendments. He wanted to solve the slavery crisis by carving the solution into the very stone of American law, making it permanent and irreversible. It was a massive, desperate bribe offered to the South to convince them to come back. The centerpiece of his plan was to resurrect the ghost of the Missouri Compromise. His first and most important amendment would re-establish the 36th parallel line and extend it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In all territory north of that line, slavery would be forever banned, but in all territory south of it, slavery would be officially recognized and protected by federal law. This would apply to all territory hereafter acquired, which was a giant wink-wink to the South's dream of expanding into Cuba and Central America. Other amendments would forbid Congress from ever abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., without the consent of its residents, from ever interfering with the interstate slave trade, and would force the federal government to compensate slave owners for unreturned fugitive slaves. And the real kicker was the final amendment. It declared that no future amendment could ever be made to the Constitution that would change these 5 amendments or give Congress the power to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. He was trying to make slavery a permanent, constitutionally untouchable part of the American fabric. It was the most generous offer the South was ever going to get, and it failed, utterly and completely. The reason it failed is the single most important thing to understand about the mindset of the country in 1861. First, the seceding states of the Deep South couldn't have cared less. They were already gone. Their goal was no longer protection within the Union. Their goal was independence from the Union. Why would they accept a compromise that gave them the right to take slaves into the southern half of the territories, when the Dred Scott decision, in their view, had already given them the right to take them everywhere? For the fire eaters, the Crittenden Compromise was a step backward. They slammed the door on the offer. But the real, immovable wall of opposition came from the North, specifically from the Republican Party. The Republicans had just won their first ever presidential election on a single, core, non-negotiable principle: no expansion of slavery into the territories. Crittenden's plan required them to completely abandon that principle before their president had even been sworn in. It would force them to agree to a constitutional amendment that would not only allow but actively protect the spread of slavery into the American Southwest and any other territory the country might grab in the future. The president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, watching from his home in Springfield, Illinois, made his position perfectly clear. He instructed the Republican senators in Washington to hold the line. "Entertain no proposition for a compromise in regard to the extension of slavery," he wrote in a private letter. "The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." Lincoln knew that to give in on this one point would be to render his entire party and the entire 1860 election meaningless. Senator Crittenden, unrolling a large map, looking haggard. "Please, gentlemen, look, we can fix this. We'll bring back the old line. The South gets constitutional protection for slavery in all future territories down here. The North gets to keep it out of the territories up here. It's a fair deal. It's the only way to avoid war." Deep South, already halfway out the door, not even looking back. "We are not interested in your lines or your deals. We are creating our own nation, where our rights won't be subject to debate. Your offer is irrelevant." The Republicans, arms crossed, resolute. "Senator, with all due respect, no, absolutely not. We will not amend the Constitution to spread human bondage. We won an election promising to stop the spread of slavery, not to become its legal guardians. The people have spoken. The answer is no." Senator Crittenden, slumping over the map. "But don't you understand? This is the last chance for peace." The Republicans, "Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of principle." A special Senate committee was formed to consider the compromise, but it was dead on arrival. The Republican members, on Lincoln's orders, voted it down, with no support from the party that was about to take power, and no interest from the states that had already left. The Crittenden Compromise collapsed. It was the final tragic failure of the political process. It proved with chilling clarity that the middle ground, the very space where compromise lives, had ceased to exist. The North would not compromise on the future of the West. The South would not compromise on its future as a slaveholding society. The time for drawing lines on maps was over. The time for drawing battle lines was about to begin. With the Crittenden Compromise lying dead on the floor of the Senate, the 7 seceded states of the Deep South were now officially in political limbo. They had declared their independence, but they weren't yet a country. They were a loose collection of sovereign republics united by a shared love of cotton and a shared terror of Abraham Lincoln, while Washington was stuck in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the old, paralyzed president to leave and the new, untested one to arrive. The South moved with the kind of speed and purpose you only see during a revolution or a Black Friday sale. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the first 6 seceded states, Texas's delegates would arrive a bit late, gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. Their mission, to transform their rebellion from a series of individual state actions into a single, unified, functioning nation. They needed a government, a constitution, an army, and a leader, and they needed it all yesterday. They wanted to present Lincoln and the rest of the world with a fait accompli, a new nation that was already up and running, a reality that could not be ignored. The atmosphere in Montgomery was electric. These men, mostly wealthy planters, lawyers, and politicians who were the cream of Southern society, genuinely believed they were the second coming of the American founding fathers. They saw themselves not as traitors destroying a nation, but as patriots perfecting one, courageously throwing off the tyranny of a hostile Northern majority. In a stunning display of efficiency, in just 4 days, they drafted and adopted a provisional constitution and declared the birth of a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Their permanent constitution, ratified a month later, is one of the most revealing documents in history, precisely because it is, for the most part, a shameless copy and paste job of the U.S. Constitution. They kept the 3 branches of government, the bicameral legislature, and most of the Bill of Rights. They did this on purpose. They wanted to argue that their beef was not with the brilliant framework of the founders, but with the way the North had twisted and perverted it. But the changes they did make, the edits they painstakingly inserted, strip away all pretense and reveal the absolute, undeniable core of their entire enterprise. First and foremost, They took the U.S. Constitution's squeamish, euphemistic language about slavery and threw it in the trash. The words slave and slavery, which never appear in the original U.S. Constitution, are all over the Confederate one. The new Constitution explicitly forbade its own Congress from ever passing any law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. It guaranteed the right of citizens to take their slaves into any new territory the Confederacy might acquire. It was a constitution that didn't just tolerate slavery, it sanctified it, making it the central, untouchable, permanent pillar of their new republic. Other changes reflected their emphasis on states' rights. The preamble begins not with "we the people," but with "we, the people of the Confederate States," each state acting in its sovereign and independent character. They gave the president a single 6-year term and a line-item veto. But these were cosmetic changes. The heart of the matter, the foundational difference, was slavery. Lest you think we're reading this with modern bias, let's hear it from the man they chose as their vice president, Alexander Stephens of Georgia. In a famous speech in Savannah in March 1861, known as the Cornerstone Speech, Stephens laid out the philosophical foundation of his new country with chilling clarity. He said the original U.S. Constitution was based on the fundamentally wrong idea that all men are created equal. He then declared, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Personified dialogue inside the Confederate Constitutional Convention. Delegate 1, "All right, let's get this done. U.S. Constitution's a good starting point. First order of business, Cottrell plus F, persons held to service. Replace with slaves. Let's call a thing a thing." Delegate 2, "Excellent. Now add a new article. Something like, the institution of Negro slavery, as it now exists in the Confederate States, shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government. And let's add a clause making that article unamendable, ever." Delegate 3, "I like it. It's the old Constitution, but with better features. It's the Founder's vision, version 2.0, with all the bugs, like that pesky implication of human equality, patched out. There you have it, straight from the horse's mouth." This was not a nation founded on the principle of low tariffs or abstract states' rights. It was a nation built as a direct and explicit refutation of the idea of human equality. The Confederacy was the world's first and only republic to be explicitly founded on the principle of racial slavery. They saw themselves as innovators, creating a stable, orderly, and prosperous society by correcting the errors of Thomas Jefferson and the Enlightenment. With their new government established and their philosophical cornerstone firmly in place, all they needed now was a president to lead their bold, terrifying new experiment. The brand new Confederate States of America had a constitution, a capital, and a revolutionary cause. Now it needed a leader. The delegates in Montgomery, Alabama knew that their choice for provisional president would be a signal to the world, and more importantly to the skittish states of the Upper South like Virginia and North Carolina, about what kind of nation they intended to be. Were they a chaotic mob of wild-eyed radicals, or were they a sober, respectable republic founded on conservative principles? The obvious candidates were the men who had been the loudest, most passionate advocates for secession for years, the fire eaters. Men like the brilliant but volatile Robert Toombs of Georgia, who fully expected to get the job, or the father of the secessionist movement himself, William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama. But the convention, in a moment of shrewd political calculation, decided to pass them over. Yancey and Toombs were too radical, too hot-headed. They were the guys you wanted to get the revolution started, but they weren't the guys you wanted to reassure nervous allies or project an image of stability and permanence. The Confederacy, the delegates decided, needed a statesman. It needed a Southern George Washington. They found their man in Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. On paper, Davis was the perfect choice, a walking embodiment of the Southern planter aristocrat ideal. He was a graduate of West Point. He had served with distinction in the U.S. Army, becoming a genuine war hero for his actions in the Mexican-American War. He had been an effective Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, proving he had executive experience. He had been a powerful and respected U.S. Senator. He was intelligent, dignified, eloquent, and possessed an unshakable devotion to the Southern cause. Crucially, he was not seen as a radical fire-eater. He had consistently argued that secession should be the last, solemn resort, not the first emotional impulse. He was, in short, the perfect respectable face for a treasonous rebellion. On February 9, 1861, the Montgomery Convention unanimously elected him provisional president. There was just one small problem. Jefferson Davis did not want the job. At all. While the delegates were casting their votes, Davis was hundreds of miles away at Briarfield, his sprawling Mississippi plantation. He had resigned from the Senate and come home to await his new assignment, which he fully expected, and desperately hoped, would be as the commanding general of the Confederate Army. He was a military man at heart. That was where he believed his talents lay. The telegram from Montgomery arrived while he and his wife, Verena, were in their rose garden. As she later recalled, she watched him read the message, and from the grim, stricken look on his face, she assumed some family tragedy had occurred. He told her the news. He had not been made a general. He had been made the president. According to his wife, he read the telegram in silence, with a look of such profound sadness that it was clear he saw the presidency not as an honor, but as a crushing burden. He was being asked to be a politician and a nation builder when all he wanted to be was a soldier. This reluctance is the key to understanding the man who would lead the South through its fiery birth and bloody death. Jefferson Davis was a patriot, but he was a reluctant rebel leader. He was a man of immense personal integrity, but he was also rigid, brittle, and notoriously thin-skinned. He was a micromanager who had trouble delegating, and he was prone to getting bogged down in pointless feuds with his generals and cabinet members. He lacked the common touch, the folksy wisdom, and the shrewd political flexibility that defined his counterpart in the North. Where Abraham Lincoln was a master of managing egos and inspiring loyalty through humor and empathy, Davis was formal, legalistic, and often aloof. He was a capable administrator tasked with leading a revolution, a bureaucrat in a role that demanded a messiah. Personified dialogue at the Montgomery Convention. Georgia. So who's it going to be? Toombs is pacing outside. He's certain it's him. He's already practicing his inaugural address. South Carolina. Toombs is a brilliant drunk, but he's too impulsive. We need someone who projects gravitas. We need to look like a government, not a bar fight. What about Davis of Mississippi? Alabama. Davis? He was one of the last to jump on the secession train. Is he radical enough? South Carolina. That's precisely the point. He looks moderate. He's a war hero, a former cabinet secretary. He's our in with Virginia. We get the radical revolution we want, but we put the respectable gentleman in the front office. It's the best of both worlds. Georgia. A brilliant strategy. We'll elect a man who doesn't even want the job to lead a nation born from the very radicalism he tried to temper. What could possibly go wrong? The choice of Jefferson Davis was a reflection of the Confederacy's core contradiction. It was a radical, revolutionary movement that desperately wanted to see itself as conservative and traditional. By picking a man who accepted the presidency out of a grim sense of duty, rather than a burning ambition, they got the leader they thought they wanted. A stoic and honorable patriarch. But in the crucible of total war, what they would need was a leader with a fire in his belly and a magician's touch with people. The man they got was a proud, anxious patriot who was, from the very first day, overwhelmed by the terrible burden of the job he never asked for. While Jefferson Davis was reluctantly accepting the presidency of a new slaveholding republic in the warm, confident air of Montgomery, another president-elect was making a far more perilous journey. Abraham Lincoln, the man whose very name had become the justification for treason, had to get from his quiet home in Springfield, Illinois, to the snake pit of Washington, D.C., and it was far from certain he would make it there alive. His train journey to the capital was a slow, 2-week-long ordeal, punctuated by dozens of whistle-stop speeches and, more pressingly, by the constant, credible threat of assassination. The trip culminated in the infamous Baltimore plot. Detectives had uncovered a conspiracy to kill Lincoln as he changed trains in Baltimore, a notoriously pro-Southern city. To avoid the threat, his security detail convinced him to abandon his public schedule, don a soft hat and an overcoat as a light disguise, and sneak through the city on a secret, middle-of-the-night train. He arrived in Washington unannounced, like a thief in the night. To his supporters, it was a prudent security measure. To his enemies, it was proof that he was a coward, a guerrilla skulking into the Capitol in fear. It was an ignominious start to the most difficult presidency in American history. The Washington that greeted him was not a capital. It was a fortress teetering on the edge of a civil war. The city itself was a Southern town, and rumors were rampant that Confederate militias were planning to disrupt the inauguration and seize the government. The outgoing administration had placed the city under what was essentially martial law. Soldiers were everywhere. Cavalry patrolled the streets, sharpshooters perched on the rooftops overlooking the inaugural stand. Artillery was placed to command the bridges over the Potomac. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office surrounded by bayonets. It was in this atmosphere of extreme tension that he delivered his first inaugural address. The speech was his first, best, and last chance to avert a war. He had to perform an impossible rhetorical balancing act. He needed to reassure the anxious slave states of the Upper South that he was not a radical threat, while simultaneously making it clear to the 7 seceded states of the new Confederacy that he did not recognize their independence and would not surrender the Union. It was a lawyer's brief, a philosopher's plea, and a commander-in-chief's warning all rolled into one. First, he offered the olive branch. He spoke directly to the South and its fears. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists," he stated, quoting his own past speeches. "I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." He went on to say he had no objection to an amendment to the Constitution that would explicitly protect slavery in the states. He was trying with all his rhetorical power to convince them that he was not the monster they had been led to believe he was. Then he laid down the law. He argued that from a legal and historical perspective, the Union was perpetual, unbreakable. No state on its own whim could simply decide to leave. Therefore, he declared, all the ordinances of secession were legally void. He was the president of the whole country, he argued, and he had a solemn sworn oath to uphold the laws in all of it. Finally came the veiled threat, the or else. While promising that the government will not assail you, he made one thing crystal clear. He would execute the laws of the United States in all states, and he would hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government. This was the critical line. He was talking about federal forts, specifically Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. He was saying, "I'm not invading you, but I'm also not leaving." He then brilliantly placed the responsibility for what came next directly on the Confederacy's shoulders. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." He ended not with a threat, but with a plea, a beautiful poetic appeal to the nation's shared history. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Personified dialogue. The speech, simplified. Lincoln. Okay, listen up. To my Southern friends, I swear I am not touching slavery in your states. I have no right and no desire to. We cool? Okay. Now, to the folks who've left, legally, you can't. The Union is forever. So technically, you're still in. Confederacy. From across a deep chasm. We don't believe you. And we are most certainly out. Now get your soldiers out of our forts. Lincoln. About that. Those are federal forts. I kinda have to, hold them. But look, I'm not starting a fight. If a fight starts, it's because you started it. Now let's all remember we're friends and listen to our better angels, okay? Confederacy. Those aren't angels we hear. That's the sound of you threatening us. Your move, Mr. Lincoln. It was a masterful speech, one of the greatest in American history, and it changed absolutely nothing. In the North, it was seen as a perfect blend of firmness and conciliation. In the Confederacy, it was heard as a smug, condescending declaration of war. Lincoln had offered a hand in friendship, but in that hand, the South also saw a sword. The better angels had gone silent. The stage was now set for the final standoff, a test of wills over a small brick-and-mortar fort in the middle of a South Carolina harbor. Abraham Lincoln had drawn his line in the sand with the ink of his inaugural address. He would not invade the South, but he would hold, occupy, and possess all federal property. And with that one phrase, the focus of the entire national crisis, the hopes of peace, and the fears of war, all zoomed in on a single five-sided brick fort sitting on a pile of granite in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fate of the United States now rested on the standoff at Fort Sumter. For the newly minted Confederate States of America, and especially for South Carolina, Fort Sumter was an intolerable insult. It was a physical manifestation of United States authority, a star-spangled middle finger planted right in the throat of their most important port city. Every morning, the citizens of Charleston would wake up and see the U.S. flag flying defiantly in their harbor. It was an affront to their sovereignty, a symbol that their independence was not yet complete. They wanted it gone. For Abraham Lincoln and the Union, the fort was the last remaining symbol of federal power in the heart of the rebellion. To abandon it would be a de facto recognition of the Confederacy. It would be a signal of weakness, a humiliating retreat that would legitimize secession and likely cause the skittish border states to join the Confederacy. Fort Sumter was no longer just a fort. It was a chess piece in the ultimate game of geopolitical chicken. Stuck inside this symbolic pressure cooker was a small garrison of about 85 U.S. soldiers, commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Anderson was a tragic figure perfectly cast for a national tragedy. He was a Kentuckian, a loyal U.S. Army officer, but also a former slave owner who was deeply sympathetic to the South. He hated the idea of war and was desperately trying to keep the peace. Commanding the thousands of newly formed Confederate troops surrounding the harbor was General P.G.T. Beauregard, a dashing, confident Creole from Louisiana, and in a twist of fate so perfect you couldn't make it up, Beauregard had been Anderson's favorite star artillery student back at West Point 30 years earlier. The pupil was now tasked with besieging his old master. For weeks, the situation was a tense, surreal stalemate. Anderson's men were isolated in the fort, watching as Beauregard's forces built a ring of powerful cannons and mortars around the harbor, all aimed directly at them. But Anderson's most immediate enemy wasn't the Confederate artillery, it was his own supply closet. The garrison was running out of food. By early April, Anderson sent a dispatch to Washington with a clear deadline. If not resupplied, he and his men would be starved into surrender by the middle of the month. The ticking clock of starvation landed squarely on Lincoln's desk, forcing him to make the first great decision of his presidency. His cabinet was hopelessly divided. The Hawks said to send in the Navy and fight their way into the harbor to reinforce the fort. The Doves said to abandon the fort, arguing that it wasn't worth a war. Lincoln, in a moment of political genius, chose a third option, a move so clever it was practically a trap. He decided he would not send troops or ammunition. He would not, in other words, reinforce the fort in a military sense. He would only send ships to resupply the garrison with provisions, food, medicine, and mail. That's it. Then came the masterstroke. He sent a clerk to Charleston to formally notify the governor of South Carolina of his intentions. The message was simple and devastatingly effective. A naval expedition is on its way to Fort Sumter for the sole purpose of delivering food to hungry men. If the mission is not fired upon, no troops or weapons will be delivered. It was a heads-I win, tails-you-lose move of breathtaking political skill. Lincoln had taken the burden of choice off his own shoulders and placed it squarely onto Jefferson Davis's. If the Confederates let the unarmed supply ships pass, the fort would remain in Union hands, The U.S. flag would continue to fly over Charleston, and Lincoln would have won a massive symbolic victory without firing a shot. The Confederacy would look weak and foolish. If, on the other hand, the Confederates opened fire on unarmed ships trying to deliver bread to starving soldiers, then they would be the aggressors. They would have started a civil war over a humanitarian mission. The North, which was still deeply divided, would be instantly united in patriotic fury. Personified dialogue, a telegraph exchange. Confederacy, Davis, Mr. Lincoln. Your troops are illegally occupying a fort in our sovereign harbor. Withdraw them, stop. Union, Lincoln. Gentlemen, the fort is property of the United States. It remains. Stop. Confederacy, Davis. We are aware your men are running low on hardtack. A bloodless surrender is imminent. Do not interfere. Stop. Union, Lincoln. Have decided to send provisions only. Just food. No guns, no troops. If you allow this peaceful resupply, there will be no conflict. If you fire on said ships, you will be the aggressor. The world is watching. Stop. Lincoln had masterfully maneuvered the Confederacy into an impossible position. He had seized the moral high ground. The question of war or peace, the future of the American Republic, now depended entirely on how the new government in Montgomery would respond. Would they swallow their pride and suffer a humiliating political defeat? Or would they fire the first shot of a war for which the whole world would now blame them? Jefferson Davis and his cabinet now had to make the most important decision of their new nation, his short and possibly final life. Lincoln's message, "We're sending food, the first shot is up to you," arrived in the Confederate capital of Montgomery like a ticking bomb. It was a masterpiece of political warfare, and Jefferson Davis and his cabinet understood its implications perfectly. They were trapped. Lincoln had backed them into a corner, forcing them to choose between a humiliating political defeat and starting a war for which they would be universally blamed. The brand new Confederate government held a series of tense, frantic cabinet meetings to decide the fate of their new nation. The debate was fierce. There was a voice of caution, a voice of sanity that saw Lincoln's trap for exactly what it was. That voice belonged to Robert Toombs, the Confederate Secretary of State. Toombs, who had been a fire-breathing secessionist just months before, now saw the abyss opening up before them. He stood before Jefferson Davis and the rest of the cabinet and delivered one of the most chillingly accurate prophecies in American history. "Mr. President," he pleaded, "at this time it is suicide, murder, and will lose us every friend at the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest which extends from mountain to ocean, and legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." He was arguing to let the supply ships land. So what if the fort was resupplied? It was a temporary setback. The Confederacy was a reality, a government controlling a vast territory. Getting into a shooting war over a single fort and being seen as the aggressor was an act of strategic insanity. But Toombs's was a lonely voice. The hawks in the cabinet argued with a passion born of revolutionary fervor and national pride. Their position was simple: to back down now, to let Lincoln's ships sail into Charleston Harbor unopposed, would be a fatal humiliation. It would make their new nation, their glorious experiment in slaveholding liberty, look like a complete joke. What kind of sovereign nation allows a foreign power to maintain a military fortress in its most important harbor? To allow the fort to be resupplied would be to admit that their sovereignty was a sham. It would be a confession of weakness that would kill their cause in its cradle. This was the argument that won the day, and it was the argument that Jefferson Davis ultimately accepted. He and his cabinet made a calculated gamble, a decision based on three massive and ultimately catastrophic assumptions. First, the issue of sovereignty was paramount. They believed that a nation is not a nation until it can control its own territory. Taking Fort Sumter was, in their minds, the final necessary act of their national birth. Second, they believed that a fight was the only way to win over the still hesitant states of the Upper South. Their greatest prize was Virginia, the oldest, largest, and most prestigious of all the southern states. Virginia was still holding out, hoping for a compromise. The Confederate leadership believed that a bold, decisive military action would force Virginia's hand. Once blood was spilled, they reasoned, Virginia and the other border states would have to choose, and surely they would choose to side with their southern kinsmen against the Yankee aggressors. A fight, they gambled, would not divide the South, but unite it. Third, and this was their most fatal miscalculation, they completely underestimated the North's will to fight. They had convinced themselves that the North was a society of greasy mechanics and money-obsessed merchants who had no stomach for a real war. They believed that if they took the fort quickly and decisively, the shocked and divided North would protest, but ultimately they would just let the South go in peace. The idea of the North raising a massive army and waging a 4-year war of total conquest was, to them, utterly unthinkable. So the decision was made. They would call Lincoln's bluff. They would not wait for the supply ships. They would demand the immediate surrender of Fort Sumter, and if Major Anderson refused, they would take it by force. Personified dialogue, the Confederate cabinet debates. Jefferson Davis. Lincoln has played his hand. He dares us to fire the first shot. Toombs here believes it's a fatal error. Robert Toombs. It is fatal. It's a hornet's nest, I tell you. Let the damn bread land, we can deal with the fort later. Don't start a war where we are so clearly in the wrong. Second of War L.P. Walker. Wrong? What is wrong about asserting our sovereignty? If we let those ships pass, we are not a nation. We are a joke. Virginia will laugh at us and stay in the Union. The world will laugh at us, we must act. A little bloodletting will be good for the spirit of the country. Jefferson Davis, after a long, pained silence. Mr. Walker is right. Our honor and our national credibility are at stake. We cannot back down. We will demand the fort's surrender. If they refuse, we will reduce it. On April 10, 1861, a telegram went out from Montgomery to Charleston. It authorized General Beauregard to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter. If the demand was refused, he was to proceed to take the fort by force. The Confederate leadership had stared into Lincoln's trap, understood it perfectly, and then decided to walk right into it with their eyes wide open. They were convinced that a short, glorious fight would secure their independence forever. They were about to find out just how big that hornet's nest really was. The telegram from Montgomery was a death warrant for peace. In Charleston, General P.G.T. Beauregard now had his orders: take the fort. But even at this late hour, the beginning of the American Civil War was conducted with a bizarre, almost theatrical sense of Southern etiquette. This would not be a surprise attack. It would be a formally announced one. Shortly after noon on April 11, 1861, Beauregard sent 3 aides, led by the distinguished ex-Senator James Chestnut, in a small boat across the harbor to Fort Sumter. They delivered a formal note to Major Robert Anderson, demanding the fort's surrender. Anderson, as they knew he would, refused. His honor as an officer of the United States Army required it. But as the Confederate emissaries were about to leave, the exhausted Major Anderson added a heartbreakingly honest off-the-record comment. He told them that if they just waited, the fort would be theirs anyway. "Gentlemen," he said, "if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days." This comment threw the Confederates into a state of confusion. Anderson was basically offering a surrender with a deadline. Chestnut and his party rushed back to Beauregard with the news. Beauregard, seeing a chance to avoid bloodshed, telegraphed the new information to his superiors in Montgomery. The Confederate cabinet, after another debate, sent back a reply. If Major Anderson would give them a precise date and time for his evacuation, they would hold their fire. So, for a second time, the small boat made its way across the dark, choppy waters of Charleston Harbor. It was now past midnight on April 12th. The emissaries arrived at Fort Sumter around 1 a.m. and presented Anderson with the new offer. Anderson, knowing Lincoln's supply ships were supposedly on their way, could not give them a specific time. He told them he would evacuate by noon on April 15th, unless he was resupplied or received new orders before then. For the Confederate aides, that unless was unacceptable. They were young, full of revolutionary fire, and had been given the authority by Beauregard to make the final decision. Without consulting their general again, they made the most fateful choice of their lives. At 3:20 a.m. inside the lamp-lit confines of Fort Sumter, James Chestnut handed Major Anderson a small, written note. It informed him that the Confederate batteries would open fire in 1 hour. The student had just told his old teacher that class was over, and the final exam was about to begin. The emissaries then saluted, got back in their boat, and rowed to nearby Fort Johnson, where they gave the commander of the mortar battery a simple order: fire. At 4:30 in the morning, on April 12, 1861, the pre-dawn stillness was shattered. A single mortar shell fired from Fort Johnson traced a fiery, parabolic arc across the black sky and burst with a flash of light and a puff of smoke directly above Fort Sumter. It was the signal. Within minutes, a ring of 43 Confederate cannons and mortars from batteries all around the harbor opened up, and the Civil War began. The bombardment was a terrifying and awesome spectacle. For the citizens of Charleston, it was the greatest show on earth. They had been waiting for this moment for months with a mixture of anxiety and giddy anticipation. They climbed onto their verandas and rooftops, dressed in their finest clothes, holding glasses of wine and champagne. They watched the shells scream across the sky and smash into the fort, cheering with every hit. It was a spectator sport, a violent festival celebrating the birth of their new nation. Personified dialogue, the final meeting in the fort. Confederate aide, Chestnut. Major Anderson. We have one final offer from General Beauregard. If you will state the exact time of your evacuation, we will hold our fire. Major Anderson. I will evacuate by noon on the 15th, unless I receive new orders or am resupplied before then. Confederate aide shakes his head. That condition is unacceptable, Major. It is with regret that I must inform you that our batteries will open fire upon Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. Major Anderson, walking them to their boat. If we do not meet again in this world, I hope we may meet in the better one. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson and his small garrison took cover. They were hopelessly outgunned and had no desire to waste ammunition or lives in a pointless defense. For the first 2.5 hours, they didn't even fire back. Finally, at 7 a.m., the Union guns answered. The man who aimed the first Union cannon of the Civil War was Captain Abner Doubleday, a staunch abolitionist who, legend incorrectly claims, also invented baseball. The fort's return fire was sporadic and largely ineffective. They were low on gunpowder cartridges and could only use the guns in the lower, more protected casemates, which couldn't be elevated high enough to hit most of the Confederate batteries. For the next 34 hours, Fort Sumter would endure a relentless, deafening, and surprisingly one-sided beating. The family feud had turned violent. The talking was over. The shells were now speaking, and they were speaking the language of war. The bombardment of Fort Sumter was a 34-hour-long siege that was both terrifyingly intense and surreally bloodless. Over 3,000 Confederate shells were hurled at the island fortress, shaking the ground and sending brick and mortar flying. Inside the fort, Major Anderson's men were trapped in a smoky, deafening hell. The Confederates began firing hot shot, cannonballs heated in a furnace until they glowed red, which quickly set the wooden barracks inside the fort on fire. Soon, the greatest threat to the Union garrison wasn't the enemy shells, but asphyxiation. Thick black smoke filled the casemates, forcing the soldiers to lie flat on the stone floors, covering their mouths with wet cloths just to breathe. At one point, the fort's main flagpole was struck by a shell, and the American flag toppled into the dust. In a moment of pure, almost cinematic defiance, an officer and a few soldiers braved the constant shelling. Jury rigged a new, shorter pole and rehoisted the flag. This small act of courage was so impressive that the Confederate gunners in the surrounding batteries, seeing the flag go back up, actually stopped firing for a moment and let out a cheer before resuming their work. It was a bizarre, gentlemanly war, but a war nonetheless. By the second day, April 13th, Anderson's position was completely hopeless. His fort was crumbling. The barracks were a raging inferno, and the flames were creeping perilously close to his main powder magazine, which held 300 barrels of gunpowder. An explosion was imminent. The relief ships Lincoln had sent were visible on the horizon, but a nasty storm prevented them from entering the harbor. His men were exhausted, half-blinded by smoke, and had all but run out of usable ammunition. He had defended his post and his nation's honor. There was nothing more to be done. At 2:30 p.m., Major Robert Anderson ordered the white flag of surrender raised over Fort Sumter. The outcome of this first ferocious battle of the Civil War was astonishing. After 34 hours of continuous bombardment, with thousands of shells fired, the total number of combat fatalities was exactly 0. Not one Union soldier and not one Confederate soldier was killed. A few men were wounded, and a Confederate mule had met an untimely end, but that was it. The war had begun with all the sound and fury of a real battle, but with the casualty list of a minor traffic accident. It gave both sides the dangerously misleading impression that this war was going to be a grand, glorious affair, a romantic spectacle with very little cost. The war's first real tragedy would come, ironically, during the surrender ceremony. As a condition of surrender, Anderson insisted on being allowed to fire a 100-gun salute to his flag before evacuating. During the 47th shot of this salute, a stray spark ignited a nearby pile of gunpowder cartridges. The resulting explosion instantly killed one Union artillerist, Private Daniel Howe, and mortally wounded another. The first men to die in the American Civil War died not in the heat of battle, but in a freak accident while saying goodbye to their flag. It was a grim and clumsy omen for the industrial-scale slaughter that was to come. The news of the surrender was received very differently on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. In Charleston and across the new Confederacy, there was pure, unadulterated ecstasy. They had done it. They had stood up to the mighty United States, fired on its flag, and taken its fort. Their new nation was no longer a theoretical entity. It was a reality, baptized by fire and victorious in its first test of arms. Their great gamble, they believed, had paid off spectacularly. Personified dialogue, the North before and after, Northerner 1, a Peace Democrat, April 11th. This is madness. Lincoln should evacuate the fort. A war would be a catastrophe. We must pursue every avenue of compromise with our Southern brethren. Northerner 2, a cautious Republican, April 11th. We must be firm, but let's not be hasty. A show of force should be enough. Surely they won't actually fire on their own country's flag. The news arrives. Fort Sumter has surrendered. Northerner 1, April 14th. They fired on the flag. On our flag. The traitors. Where do I enlist? The Union must be preserved by force. Northerner 2, April 14th. This is an act of war, an insult to the Republic. To arms. Crush the rebellion. These traitors must be taught a lesson they will never, ever forget. In the North, the news of Sumter's surrender was the spark that ignited the hornet's nest Robert Toombs had predicted. The months of division, apathy, and debate over compromise vanished in a single blinding flash of patriotic rage. The abstract political argument had suddenly become personal. Those weren't just rebels in a distant state. They were traitors who had fired on American soldiers and desecrated the American flag. From Boston to Chicago, massive, spontaneous Unionist rallies erupted. The time for talking was over. The insult could not be borne. The North, which had been a sleeping, divided giant, was now wide awake, and it was absolutely furious. The bloodless battle had just made a very bloody war inevitable. The ashes of Fort Sumter had barely cooled, but its surrender had accomplished what months of political debate could not. It had forged a unified, enraged, and resolute North. The sleeping giant was awake, and Abraham Lincoln knew this was his moment to act. He now had the one thing he had been missing, a united public opinion demanding retribution. He would not waste it. On April 15, 1861, the day after Anderson's garrison marched out of the fort, Lincoln issued a proclamation that would formally turn the Cold War hot. He did not go to Congress to ask for a declaration of war. To do so would be to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate enemy nation. Instead, he acted under his authority as commander-in-chief. He declared that an insurrection existed in the 7 seceded states, an insurrection too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. And then he made the call. He requested that the loyal states of the Union provide 75,000 militia volunteers to serve for a term of 90 days to put the rebellion down. 90 days. That one detail speaks volumes. In the spring of 1861, almost everyone in the North, from the president on down, believed this would be a short, sharp police action. a quick, decisive campaign to march south, disperse the rebel armies, and restore federal authority. The idea of a 4-year, continent-spanning meat grinder that would consume 600,000 lives was simply beyond the realm of imagination. This was going to be a summer war, and the boys would be home by fall. In the North, Lincoln's call to arms was met with a tidal wave of patriotic enthusiasm. The attack on the flag had transformed the abstract principle of union into a sacred cause. In every city and town, recruitment offices were mobbed. Quotas were filled in days, sometimes hours. The governor of Ohio telegraphed Washington, "We will furnish the largest number you will receive." The governor of Indiana offered double his state's quota. Immigrants who could barely speak English lined up alongside farm boys and factory workers. Lincoln's old political rival, Stephen Douglas, rushed to the White House to pledge his unwavering support, telling the president, "There can be no neutrals in this war, only patriots or traitors." The North, a region of squabbling states and political factions just a week earlier, was now a single unified war machine, humming with rage and resolve. But Lincoln's proclamation was not just a call to arms for the North. It was a final, unavoidable ultimatum for the 8 slave states that had, until this moment, remained precariously on the fence. These states of the upper and border South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, had walked a tightrope. They had rejected the radicalism of the Deep South, but their loyalty to the Union was conditional. Their condition was simple: no coercion. They would not be part of any federal attempt to use military force against their sister Southern states. Lincoln's call for 75,000 men to invade the South was the very definition of coercion. The time for neutrality was over. The fence they had been sitting on had just been electrified. They were now forced to answer a simple, terrible question. Are you with the United States, or are you with the South? Will you send your sons to fight for the Union, or will you secede and send them to fight against it? Their response was immediate, furious, and unanimous. The governors of these states answered Lincoln's request with sputtering, indignant rage. The governor of Kentucky replied, "Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister Southern states." The governor of Tennessee declared his state will not furnish a single man for coercion, but 50,000 if necessary, for the defense of our rights. And the governor of Missouri, winning the prize for the most creative refusal, called Lincoln's request illegal, unconstitutional, revolutionary, inhuman, diabolical, and cannot be complied with. Personified dialogue, Lincoln's ultimatum. Lincoln, addressing the nation. The rebellion has begun. The Union is under attack. I need 75,000 volunteers to restore order. All loyal states, it's time to stand up and be counted. The North, as one voice. We're in. Take our sons, our money, our factories, the Union forever, death to traitors. Lincoln turns to the wavering states. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. I need your quotas filled. Your country calls. Virginia, backing away horrified. You are asking us to provide troops to invade our neighbors and kill our own people? You are asking Virginia to be a party to the subjugation of the South? Sir, you have chosen to inaugurate civil war. You get not one man from us. Lincoln, I am asking you to be loyal to the United States. Virginia, loyalty to the Union does not mean waging war on our brothers. You have forced us to choose, and we choose them. Lincoln's proclamation was a calculated risk that was both a political masterstroke and a final, irreversible step into the abyss. By waiting for the South to fire first, he had brilliantly unified the North, ensuring he would have the popular support to wage a war. But the act of calling for an army to wage that war was the very thing that would drive the Upper South out of the Union. He had secured his base of support, but in doing so, he had just handed his enemy a massive new wave of recruits, resources, and territory. The first 7 states had seceded over the fear of what Lincoln might do. The next wave was about to secede over what he had just done. The die was cast. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers was a political masterstroke that united the North, but it was a fatal blow to the unionism of the Upper South. For these states, the abstract debate was over. The federal government was now raising an army to march south, and they were being asked to contribute their own sons to that army. It was a choice between their country and their kin, and for 4 of these states, blood was thicker than the Union. The first and most important domino to fall was Virginia. Virginia was not just another state, it was the crown jewel of the South. It was the most populous, the most industrialized, and the most historically significant state in the region, the mother of presidents, the cradle of the Republic. Its state convention, which had been debating for weeks, had repeatedly voted against secession. But Lincoln's call for troops changed everything. On April 17, 1861, just 2 days after the proclamation, the convention voted to leave the Union. Virginia's secession was a cataclysm for the United States and a massive coup for the Confederacy. It gave the rebellion a huge boost in manpower, industrial capacity, thanks to the crucial Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, and, most critically, a roster of some of the most brilliant military minds in the U.S. Army. This included a quiet, dignified colonel named Robert E. Lee. Lee was a living legend, the U.S. Army's finest officer, and he was personally opposed to both slavery and secession. He was even offered command of the entire Union Army that was being raised to crush the rebellion. But in a moment of agonizing personal crisis, Lee could not bring himself to draw his sword against his home, his family, his native state of Virginia. He resigned his commission and offered his services to the Confederacy, a decision that would prolong the war by years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. With Virginia now in the fold, the Confederacy had a powerhouse on its side. In a move that was both strategically bold and symbolically potent, the Confederate capital was moved from sleepy Montgomery, Alabama, to the industrial hub of Richmond, Virginia. The two rival capitals, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, now sat just 100 miles apart, glaring at each other across the Rappahannock River. The battle lines were being drawn. The rest of the Upper South quickly followed Virginia's lead. Arkansas, seeing itself surrounded, seceded on May 6th. Tennessee, a state deeply divided between its mountainous pro-Union East and its plantation-heavy West, held a referendum and voted to join the Confederacy on June 8th. And finally, North Carolina, a state with a long history of reluctance toward the Fire Eaters, became the 11th and final state to secede on May 20th. The Confederacy was now complete. 11 states, stretching from the Atlantic to the Rio Grande, bound together by a new constitution and a shared determination to protect the institution of slavery. The political maneuvering of the secession season was over. The initial 7-state rebellion of the Deep South, which might have been contained, had now been doubled in strength by Lincoln's call to arms. A political crisis had metastasized into a full-blown civil war between two powerful, determined nations. Personified dialogue, the Union's final plea. Union. Virginia, don't do this. You are the heart of this nation. Washington, Jefferson, they were your sons. You cannot betray the house they built. Virginia. It is you who betrayed it. You have chosen to raise an army to wage war upon the South. You have asked me to send my own sons to kill their cousins in Carolina and Georgia. I will not. Union. This is not war. It is putting down an illegal insurrection. This is treason. Virginia. Sadly but firmly. No. This is a choice. And I choose to stand with my people. My decision is made. I am no longer one of you, and I shall be taking my finest soldier, Mr. Lee, with me. And so the die was cast. The lines were drawn. 11 Confederate states faced off against 23 Union states. The 4 other slaveholding border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, would remain, through a brutal combination of political persuasion and military force, uneasily in the Union, becoming battlegrounds themselves. The naive belief on both sides that this would be a short, glorious 90-day war was about to be shattered against the horrifying reality of industrial-scale slaughter. The roommate dispute over the house rules had escalated. They had labeled everything. They had argued over everything. And now, having failed to settle their differences with words, they were about to settle it with cannons. The secession season was over. The season of killing was about to begin. And that's how a series of terrible compromises, a viral novel, a bloody dress rehearsal on the prairie, a caning, a terrible court decision, a failed raid, And one incredibly consequential election led to the complete and total crack-up of the United States. In the end, two sides who could no longer speak the same political or moral language decided to communicate through the only medium they had left: violence. So please, for the love of all that is historically accurate, do not cite this podcast in your term paper. Your professor will cry. But hopefully, you now have a slightly clearer, if significantly more insane picture of how this whole mess got started. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, a failure at every level, and a perfect example of how stubborn, prideful people can drive a nation straight into an abyss. Thanks for tuning into this whirlwind tour of America's spectacular political suicide. Let us know in the comments what other absurd historical moment you want us to simplify next. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.